Okay, welcome back. Today, as you can see, we're embarking on talking about the Civil War. Sectionalism, of course, and the Civil War. What does sectionalism mean? Well, basically a dividing, right? The breakup, and of course, the war itself. Okay, and by the way, this is a process. Of course, the Civil War doesn't just come out of nowhere. In fact, I put the beginnings of the Civil War all the way at the beginning of settlement. As we have seen this semester, I've said it many times, I'll say it again, right? That different types of people settled different regions for different purposes. Okay. North and South, we saw differences between them from the very beginning. Okay. So let's get into this. I should tell you that we're not going to talk about major battles and all that kind of stuff. I'm more interested in cause and effect, what leads up to this cataclysm, and what does this cataclysm bring us, if anything. Okay, so by 1840, the issue of slavery and race, it's heating up. We've seen battles over states' rights versus the power of the federal government. I haven't gone too much into it, but I have alluded to it. By 1840, the federal government has gotten a lot bigger than the framers of the Constitution had envisioned. We've also become much more democratic than they had envisioned. At any rate, there are battles over states' rights versus federal power of government, battles over what the Constitution means. At the same time that all this is going on, we have, of course, the slavery issue heating up, continuing resistance among slaves, right? We have an emboldened abolitionist movement and a surge in westward expansion. We know that after the revolution, there was a rush to the Mississippi River, right? That's where the new nation ended, and that's where Spanish territory began. Of course, people moved into the states that were covered by the Northwest Ordinance. We know that the country was sort of cut in half at that time, with free states above the Ohio River line and states open to slavery below it. We also know that in the early 1800s, 1803, we get the Louisiana Territory. And of course, the issue comes up again. What do you do with this territory? Is it going to be slaveholding or not? What do? They just draw another line. They kind of extend the line. And of course, we get the Missouri Compromise. That was in 1820. We're going to have continued westward expansion of people coming through, and we're going to see continuing expansion that will lay the basis for the Civil War. The Civil War will grow out of Western expansion and the question of slavery in the newly conquered territories. More specifically, it will grow out of the conquest of Mexico by the United States. Now, the conquest of Mexico begins right around 1820. We know that Mexico wins its independence in 1820 from Spain. Mexico is a brand new country. It's getting on its legs. It's been weakened by war. It has no friends in the Western Hemisphere, but it does have a land-hungry nation on its eastern border. So into the 1820s and 1830s, we see white settlers from the United States just rushing into Mexico. By 1830, they outnumber the Mexican people. They had flowed into Mexico from the United States, some of them legally. They were allowed to by the Mexican government, but most of them by the 1830s have gone there illegally. A lot of these white settlers have by now become angry because Mexico has outlawed slavery. Does this in like 1829. And there have been other sorts of conflicts over the issue of slavery in these territories because Mexico did not, from its beginning, when it first actually declared its own independence in 1810, Mexico had said slavery would not be part of the future of the nation. Meanwhile, U.S. settlers are flowing in, they're bringing in slaves, and it creates conflict. So by the 1830s, this has come to a head. Now, there's conflict about other things as well, but slavery is at the heart of these things, largely. So a bunch of Texans come together, they declare independence for Mexico. This, of course, is the very quick and dirty of it. They declare independence for Mexico in 1836, and they apply for entry to the United States. Now, the way Texas looks in the beginning is this little sort of blob right there. Doesn't look like what Texas looks like today. It's just a little blob. It's right there on the eastern side there of of what is today Texas. You could probably make it out on the gray map there. In fact, it says Texas right there. That is what Texas looked like largely when it first declares its independence officially. Okay, doesn't really make for a great tattoo, I suppose, but anyway, there it is. It's a blob. And as soon as they declare independence for Mexico, they apply for entry into the United States. By 1840, Texas is still not part of the United States. It has been regarded as its own republic. It's still not part of the United States. It's claiming its independence, but Mexico does not recognize it. It's still claimed by Mexico because the Mexican government, Mexican people, they say, look, you took this unjustly. They go on to say, okay, even if Texas is independent, the border is higher than you think. So, in fact, what we have here, and if you look at this map, the Republic of Texas, as it officially stands in the eyes of the world, not Mexico, but in the eyes of the world, is that blob there on the right, that little sort of it's kind of beige, I suppose. I don't really know what color that is. And then to the left of it, we have that purple area. That is actually contested territory. Mexico says Texas doesn't really exist as its own nation. If it does exist as its own nation, it's that little blob there. And of course, Texans and the United States say, no, 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 it encompasses all that purple territory as well. Well, this is going to be a problem. White Southerners, meanwhile, they're eager for Texas to join the Union. Remember, it's still sitting out there. A lot of white Texans are flowing into Texas. They're bringing their slaves. They have these dreams of making it big, like the men back east. They know that as soon as Texas became independent, not only did it apply for annexation to the United States, but it legalized slavery almost at the very moment it declares independence. And so these Southerners are hoping that Texas will be added to the United States as a Southern slave state. Not only is this good for business, but in the minds of Southern slaveholders, especially Southerners generally, it will tip the power in favor of the Senate. If a Southern state comes in, if Texas comes in, I should say, it will come in as a Southern slave state, which means at least 2 more senators. In fact, Southerners wanted Texas, look at how big it is, wanted Texas to be 4 different states. That way they could get 8 senators, overwhelming the North in the Senate and giving the South all kinds of power. So spreading Southern power, tipping the Senate in favor of the South, all of these are on the minds of a lot of these people flowing over. Now, Northerners, meanwhile, they're like, oh, wait a minute. They fear that what would happen if Texas were to enter the Union is that slavery would, of course, spread over. So the very thing that Southerners want, Northerners fear. And Northerners, a lot of them, not all of them, they're arguing that the taking of Texas in 1836 was orchestrated by the slave power of the South, what they call the slave power conspiracy. And so Northerners, a lot of them, especially abolitionists, are saying, look, these people in the South, they want more and more power for themselves. Well, this is the state of things when in 1845, James K. Polk becomes president. James K. Polk had run on a platform of expansion. He had said, vote for me and I will work to take Texas. And in fact, all the way to the Pacific. When he wins the presidency, he claims a mandate, meaning he says, look, I told you when I was running for president that I was going to expand this nation. The people elected me, therefore they must want me to expand this nation. So he pushes Congress to annex Texas. And Congress, of course, feels that it has some political cover. Polk has a lot of juice. They decide we will annex Texas. Now, there's a whole story behind that politically, but we don't need to go into that. Point is, Texas is annexed to the United States, and this is going to spark war with Mexico. War doesn't really jump off right away, though. The tensions are high. The U.S. military goes down into the area, and what happens is that Polk orders U.S. troops into Mexican territory, not even the disputed area. They cross the Rio Grande. So they, in fact, go into the disputed areas and pass the disputed areas. Now, when they do this, the U.S. troops are ambushed, as pretty much everybody knew they would be. They're ambushed, they're destroyed by the Mexican military, and Polk now can say U.S. blood was shed on U.S. soil. At least that's what he tells the Congress and the nation. Congress declares war. Southerners are ecstatic. They're all about this, right? For example, one Southern newspaper, it's from South Carolina, by the way, it says, quote, I'll read this because I don't have this memorized. Every battle fought in Mexico and every dollar spent there ensures the acquisition of territory which must widen the field of Southern enterprise and power in the future. The final result will be to readjust the power of the Southern Confederacy so as to give us control of the operation of government in all time. Basically, what they're saying here is the taking of Texas, the annexation of Texas, and the war that jumps off from it is good for the South. That's what they're saying. The taking of territory there is going to enhance the power of the Southern Confederacy because they envision that territory will be slave holding. Now, meanwhile, Northerners are going nuts. Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison, remember him? He calls the war unjust. And he prays, he says, for the defeat of the United States by Mexico. Now, some people would call him unpatriotic. But others would say, no, this is patriotism. He says, what kind of country are you? Taking from others, taking territory from others, a sovereign nation. And you're colonizing the people that are there because there's still plenty of Mexican people there, right? And if you win this war and extend all the way to California, you're going to have a lot of Mexican people who are colonized. He says, weren't we a colony? Didn't we overthrow tyranny? Didn't we say we would be the light of republicanism around the world? Why would we do this? So in a sense, it could be considered patriotic because what he's saying is we should live up to our values. But he also fears what will happen if the United States wins and takes a territory. What's going to happen? Slavery is likely to spread. As the war goes on, many of the United States, though, they come to terms with the war because a lot of these people have already bought into the idea of manifest destiny, which you've probably heard of, right? Manifest destiny. Manifest meaning clear. It is our clear destiny to conquer, to take. And not only is it justified, it is our duty because embodied in the manifest destiny credo, this thinking is that it is God's desire. And therefore, who am I to go against God? God wants me to do this. I must do it. And a lot of people are looking eagerly at Mexican territory. U.S. settlers are flowing in to Mexican territory, not just Texas, but a lot of them in California. And of course, they're all intent on these areas joining the Union. Soon it becomes clear that Mexico's army is underpaid, it's undersupplied, it's undertrained, it's outgunned. It's going to lose. Now, there's a whole story behind this, but I can't really go into it. I'm trying to give you guys a quick and dirty on the background here so you understand how the taking of Mexican territory affects the slavery issue. Now, the war ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right? This very famous treaty. And as you probably know, Mexico takes huge pieces of land, or excuse me, the United States takes huge pieces of land from Mexico. In fact, Mexico was kind of lucky that it stopped there. In fact, Mexico was invaded all the way to its capital city. The United States made it all the way down south. There's reasons for that. There was a revolution going on, so the U.S. military took advantage of that and went down into Mexico City. Point is, they could have taken all that territory south of the Rio Grande, a lot of it. But the reason they didn't is because by this time, the population of Mexican people in the Mexican Secession area that you see, those territories, the Nevada, Utah, all that area, the Mexican population in these areas was small compared to the population of Mexican people below the border. because this area up here was not really settled too much by Spain or Mexico in the years since the founding. So there's not a whole lot of Mexicans there, but there's a lot of Mexicans south of the border. So why not take all of Mexico? Point blank, there are too many Mexicans there. That's the point of view of the United States. This Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is really, it's supposed to protect the Mexicans who are now living in a new country. But that doesn't happen. Mexican people are going to be treated horribly. They're going to have land taken from them, quote unquote, legally, by courts that, of course, don't favor them, and illegally, just by force. In fact, one of the unknowns of U.S. history is that the lynching of Mexican people, Mexican men, largely predates in large numbers the lynching of black men. Mexican Americans in the Southwest, after the war is over, 1848 onward, these people are going to be terrorized in places like Texas, especially Texas, but also in California and the other states that are forming, but more so in Texas. The Texas Rangers are going to be known as Los Ángeles de la Muerte, which just means the angels of death. Before black men are lynched in large numbers, you're seeing the lynching of Mexican Americans writ large. Now, I bring this up, I mean, it's horrific, but also to put it in perspective. You don't see the lynching of black men so much right now. You don't. You start to see it later on, but it really takes off after the Civil War. Why is this? Because at this time, in 1848, you can't just randomly lynch a man in the South who is black, because he might be somebody else's property. So it's going to cost you. So as horrible as this sounds, the fact that they were enslaved actually protected them from lynching. Not so with Mexican people in the Southwest. They're not going to have that sort of protection, to put it badly, right? It's ironic. It's perverse. But anyway, so the war is over with this treaty. The nation is going to have to come to terms with the issue of slavery in all these territories that were taken. And a lot of people are up in arms about this, so much so that it really upsets the political parties. The Whig Party, I didn't really go into them. The Whig Party, don't worry so much. The Whig Party, WHIG, if you're curious, they are sort of falling away now. And it seems like the Democratic Party, which is the party of slavery, is really on the rise, and it's going to be the only party at this time. But because of this, because of the taking of Mexico, you're going to see a new political party form. It's going to be called the Free Soil Party. Free soil. It forms in 1848, and it has this mantra. They say free soil, free speech, free labor. Their goal is to keep slavery out of the new territories taken from Mexico. But they want to do so for the benefit of white people. They want cheap land for settlers or free land for settlers. They don't want large plantations. They don't want large landowners over there. And therefore, they don't want slaves coming over because they know what's going to happen. So they want to keep slavery out for their own purposes because they want to develop that area for themselves. They want cheap land or free land. They want security. They don't want to have to sleep with one eye open because the farmer down the road or the plantation owner happens to have 100 slaves. Now, because of their view, they're actually accused of what a lot of people at the time, especially the radical abolitionists, these guys will call this white manism. You want the West for white men because they point something out. They say, look, your view on slavery is not about morality. It's not about the wrongness of it. You wish to defeat what you call the slave power conspiracy, but they call it the slave power conspiracy, the free soilers, a lot of people would say, because they want the West for themselves. They want the West, as I said, for land and security, but they also want free speech. So it's all about free speech, free labor, free soil, right? Not quite in that order. Basically free men. And for them, they're talking about themselves, free men, because wherever slavery exists, even white men don't have a lot of benefits. They don't have good labor. They don't have good jobs, and they can't speak against slavery even if they wanted to. Not that they wanted to, but they want that freedom. They don't want to be bothered with slavery. Let me just put it very blankly. The point is, they don't mind slavery where it exists now. They just don't want it to spread westward. Now, this party will attract a lot of people. It will, of course, attract a lot of white folk, but it even attracts black folk and many abolitionists, because a lot of them see this sort of as the middle of the road issue on slavery. At least some party is actually on the scene now, on the stage, and talking about slavery not spreading westward. And so a lot of abolitionists flow into this Free Soil party, and they end up working with Free Soilers. And in fact, it helps them because Free Soilers actually, because the Free Soil Party labor gives them gives these abolitionists a little bit of clout. They're able to successfully win some fights against discrimination in places like Massachusetts when it comes to like segregated schools. Massachusetts had segregated schools and they had laws against interracial marriage still. And because of the Free Soil Party and the growth of abolitionism and the abolitionists flowing into this party, they're able to fight some of these laws in the North. They start being dismantled. Segregation laws, schools, marriage. Meanwhile, the nation is looking westward with bated breath almost. Abolitionism is heating up. And in fact, it is the very taking of Mexico that is going to raise the stakes. So much so that famously, Ralph Waldo Emerson, you may have heard of this guy, right? He writes, I think he wrote Walden. Anyway, he says, yeah, we're gonna take Mexico, but Mexico will poison us. Mexico will be a poison to us. We will take it ourselves, and it'll be the end of us. And he's largely right. Because this issue of slavery in the territories taken by the United States, it's going to spark intense conflict. There will be competing arguments over how to deal with the issue of slavery in the Mexican Cession. That area on the left-hand side that says Mexican Cession. What do we do with that with regard to slavery? Now, there are going to be all these competing arguments. Many in the North, of course, are saying no slavery at all. We don't want it spreading westward. The thing about this also is that they don't. If it spreads westward, it might also spread northward. You have to remember that a lot of these people who are against slavery aren't necessarily moralistic about it. They don't like the idea of slavery spreading because it threatens their well-being as well. So a lot of people, of course, are also, I should say, a lot of people, however, are moralistic about it. So a lot of people in the North, they're like, no slavery at all. Meanwhile, John C. Calhoun, remember him, right? Slavery, a positive good. He says, well, he's already by this time, by the way, become a champion of the South and this whole, states' rights issue. He starts talking about states' rights, states' rights, states' rights. He says, well, these territories out there, when they become states, each state should decide for itself. States' rights, states' rights, states' rights. If you don't leave it up to the individual state to decide, then all the existing states should come together and vote on what to do with that territory. Either way, the federal government has no business dealing with this. This is not a federal government issue. It's a states' rights issue. But then he goes on to say, even if I'm wrong about this, even if the federal government in fact has the power over that territory somehow, they do not have the power to keep slavery out of it because of the Fifth Amendment. Now, you may recall, I mentioned this before. The Fifth Amendment actually protects the right to property. So he points to this. And maybe I didn't mention this before. I'm starting to get deja vu, I think. But here's the thing. The Constitution protects the property. Protects people's property under the Fifth Amendment. Okay, and it basically says that property cannot be taken away without due process, right? We don't have to worry about that. The point is this: the federal government protects property. And Calhoun goes on to say, The reason you cannot keep me from you can't keep me from taking my slaves into this territory, federal government, you cannot do this, is the same reason that you can't keep me from taking my horses into this territory. They're both property, he says. So you cannot do this if you're the federal government. So there's that argument, right? So you have opposing arguments. Others suggest some sort of middle ground. They will say, oh, let's extend the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the Pacific. You might remember the Missouri line. It sits right underneath Missouri's southern border and extends, of course, westward. It would cut a lot of this territory in half, right? Some of Texas, California, right? Nevada, these areas here, Colorado. Anyway, the point is, and of course beneath it, it would be Texas and what is today New Mexico and Arizona. The point is, a lot of people say, let's just cut it in half. Obviously, that's just, we're almost two countries by then. So a lot of people balk at that. A lot of people think that's doable, but everything stalls. And how is it that they actually iron this whole thing out? No surprise, they issue a compromise. The Compromise of 1850. It's a series of new laws, by the way. The Compromise of 1850 has like a bunch of different things in them, but let me give you the quick and dirty. On the one hand, you have new laws like this. In Washington, D.C., no slave trading can happen. It doesn't mean slavery is going to end itself. You don't have to get rid of your slaves, but you can't buy new ones, right? You can't trade them in Washington, D.C. Okay. It also allows California to enter the Union as a free state. And by this time, California has all this gold. So that's good for the North. So a win for the North in the fact that Washington, D.C. has no slave trade, a win for the North in the fact that California enters the Union as a free state. On the other hand, the South gets this. The federal government will assume the Texas debt. Texas owed a lot of money from all these wars. So the federal government will take over the Texas debt, which is good for Texas because Texas will enter the Union, right? It's already been in the Union for 5 years, but Texas will be a new state in the Union with no debt. It means it's an economically strong state. Kind of ironic when you think about how many Texans I know hate taxes, right? Point is, the federal government takes over the Texas debt. That means the federal government that is going to spread Texas's debt out across, taxpayers. Anyway, let's not get into that. It's also good. This is good for the South because, of course, Texas is a southern state. It's slaveholding, so they have a strong state within their ranks. And here's something else that happens. A new fugitive slave law is enacted. This is going to be a tricky one, and we're going to come back to this. Keep that one in your back of your mind. Now, we have 2 for the North and 2 for the South. Then we have one that, well, take your pick. You can tell me which side gets the better of this. The territories taken from Mexico will be up for popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, right, just means that the people will vote on whether or not to have slavery. It's kind of Calhoun's argument, right? Because he had said this. He said, let the people decide. Let the state decide, at least. But here, it's going to be on the people voting within their particular territory. Now, which side does this benefit? Well, interestingly, from the reactions, both sides love this. In fact, a lot of people praised the Compromise of 1850. A lot of people are thinking, oh my God, we avoided war, thank goodness. Even many people in the North think that popular sovereignty is fair. A lot of Northerners say, hey, that territory belonged to Mexico. We didn't have it before. At least now we have a shot at it. In fact, Northerners reason that there are many more Northerners than Southerners right now because the Northern population has boomed, especially from immigration, right? There are so many more Northerners than Southerners that we can just shoot ourselves over there, right? Settle there and outvote them. That's the thinking. Meanwhile, the Southerners are satisfied. Popular sovereignty, yes, we are outnumbered by the Northerners. I get it, but we are just going to do everything we can to actually outvote them. We have a shot at this. Point about this popular sovereignty thing is that many settlers begin to start flowing westward because of this. And so we're going to see a rush to the Pacific. And by 1850, the country looks like this, right? So we have obviously the slave states in orange, the free states in green. And we have, of course, the Utah and New Mexico territory. That's the Mexican cession. That's the territory taken from Mexico. That's going to be open to popular sovereignty. Notice the unorganized territory above the Missouri Compromise line. Remember, the Missouri line's still there. Therefore, no slavery there. We just haven't gotten to building states yet there. So no slavery in the organized territory above that line, but slavery in the Utah and New Mexico territory, which are above that line, kind of, right? It's fine there. Popular sovereignty, at least. And so a lot of people are happy about this. We avoided war, thank goodness, but the praise is not going to last. They're going to have a new crisis on their hands, and it's called the Fugitive Slave Law. Oh, I thought I moved this. Why did I put this in here? I'm not sure. I don't remember why I put this one there. I thought I had moved this out. Anyway, it's pretty much the same as the prior slide, except that you get a better feel for the fact that Texas after 1850 is really looking the way Texas looks today, right? Texas looked like that, you know, they had that extension to the northwest of it, you know, sort of like a growth or something. Anyway, this is the picture I was looking for. That is the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, you should understand, this is a federal statute, S-T-A-T-U-T-E, right? It's not a statue, it's not a sculpture, right? It's a statute, a law. So it's a federal statute. A statute, by the way, is just a law made by a governing body, like Congress, for example. So Congress passes the Fugitive Slave Law. This is a statute intended to enforce the Fugitive Slave Clause, which was already in the Constitution. You might remember that. The thing about the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution is that all it really says was that any slave fleeing to the free areas must be sent back. What's lacking is how to do that, enforcement of it. Who's going to do it? So the federal government passes an enforcement statute, the Fugitive Slave Law, and it adds procedure to the substance of the Fugitive Slave Clause, which requires the return of fugitive slaves. Now, here is the problem. It's the procedure that's going to be the problem that's going to really rankle the North. Under the Fugitive Slave Law, it's going to make it a lot easier to get slaves back. It's even going to make it easier to enslave free people, or people who are never slaves, or people who are freed. Here's what it does. So if I'm a slave catcher, I go into a free state, Ohio, let's say. I can go up there and I can say, that slave is a runaway, point you out, bring you to court, and you get no jury. An accused fugitive gets no jury trial. This is a problem because the North is already, the nation generally is all about jury trials, right? They like this about them. One of the reasons that they broke ties with England is because they weren't allowed jury trials, by the way. And so no jury is a problem. And of course, the local courts are like, well, wait a minute, we do it this way with juries. If we want to do it, we should be able to do it. But the Fugitive Slave Statute says no. No jury. Also, no right to testify in your own defense if you are an accused runaway. Again, a problem because in the North, they already had these laws that allowed for a jury, allowed for Black people to testify in their own defense. There's another problem, and that is that federal marshals are going to be used to enforce the law. So the federal marshals, these are people, by the way, who like transport federal prisoners and so forth, right? They're federal agents, federal police in a sense, right? Law enforcement. They enforce this law too. The states, by the way, states don't have to enforce federal law, just by the way, just so you know. So if you want a federal law enforced and the state's not doing it because they don't have to, the federal government can do it. Here, the Northerners are on fire because here you have, and this is really something that's happening, more so than before. You have federal power under via federal marshals being extended into free states. So federal marshals are enforcing the law. They're going into free territory, free states, and picking people up. And it gets worse for the Northerners. The federal marshals can engage in deputization. They can deputize you. Anyone in the North to be a slave catcher. So, for example, if I am a marshal and I come up to Ohio and you are an abolitionist, you're William Lloyd Garrison, I pick you out. Well, guess what? You just became a slave catcher. You have to help me. Or you might just be some white farmer guy or even a Black guy, farmer guy, right? Who doesn't want anything to do with this. Maybe you just care about your farm, or maybe you do care. Either way, you're going to become a slave catcher. Northerners are livid about this. The South is using federal power to abuse Northern rights. Just to recap, they're abusing states' rights with federal marshals going into free states. They're abusing states' rights because, in fact, Northern laws that allowed for protection of people in the North, these are called personal liberty laws, by the way. These things, and I didn't go into this, but here's a decent place to put it. These personal liberty laws, laws that had allowed for juries for fugitives, laws that allowed accused fugitives to testify in their own defense. Those personal liberty laws had already 8 years prior been squashed by the Supreme Court. Personal liberty laws in some states said that if a slave comes here, that person is automatically free when they enter and they step on free soil. Some of them, of course, only said, oh, you get a trial, you get a jury, you get to testify in your own defense. But by 1850, it's been superseded. And now with the fugitive slave law, it gets even worse for them because not only are state laws superseded by the Supreme Court, but now federal marshals are actually in your territory. And to make things worse, federal power is not just reaching into states and squashing states' rights, but it's actually squashing the personal rights of Northerners via deputization. For example, if you just tell me, no, sorry, Marshal, I'm not doing it, guess what? You're going to jail, or you're going to get a hefty fine. You have no choice. So you're going to be deputized. So in a sense, white freedoms are being trampled here. You have no choice here. You have no voice. And Northerners are upset about this. And they're also upset about the fact that it makes it easy to capture people. Many of these people who were considered fugitive slaves had run away from the South a long time before, had lived freely in the North for years, had, established their lives. And now, because of the fugitive slave law, they're going to be hunted down. And that doesn't sit well with a lot of white folk in the North. They just think it's unfair. Whether they like Black people or not, they think it's unfair. It's not right. They also are upset because they know free people can be sold into slavery. Now, all of this, of course, has morality built into it, but also they realize that the power of the South seems to be overwhelming. The Southerners are like, no, you Northerners had for a very long time worked against our interests. The Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution was there and you ignored it. The Fugitive Slave Law is meant to stop or even reverse the flow of slaves that are going through the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, as I mentioned before, depending on who you ask, but in terms of who we can actually point to and say these are people who were freed by the Underground Railroad, not just people who ran away and then said, I came through the Underground Railroad, but people who were part of this actual system, who actually got the benefit of this system, only several hundred. But the Southerners fear that the Underground Railroad is really responsible for the flow of slaves northward. And there was a flow of slaves northward. So, in the minds of Southerners, not surprisingly, those two things are tied together. Oops. So the fugitive slave law will result in several hundred people being shipped to the South over the course of time from 1850 on through the beginning of the Civil War. Okay. Now, the consequences of all of this is deep division between the North and South. You're going to see protests against slavery rise dramatically after this. Support for abolitionism soars. Support for the Underground Railroad soars. And abolitionism actually becomes more radical. Abolitionist groups, both black and white, they hold mass meetings, they swear to oppose the fugitive slave law. William Lloyd Garrison, this guy, he burns a copy of the U.S. Constitution. He calls the Constitution a covenant with death, an agreement from hell. Why? Because of the dirty compromise. Now, Frederick Douglass actually sees things a little differently. Frederick Douglass contradicts Garrison. He says, look, the Constitution is the most fertile soil from which freedom could blossom. So Douglass prefers to see the Constitution in the light of freedom, a more positive light. Of course, William Lloyd Garrison is white, Frederick Douglass is black. So maybe it's easier for someone like William Lloyd Garrison to say the things that he does. To say that the Constitution is a covenant with death, an agreement from hell, doesn't sound the same coming from a black man, formerly enslaved, one who is working through the system, trying to end slavery. So what happens in the wake of the 1850 Compromise, which of course contains this fugitive slave law, is that white abolitionism will rise, and abolitionists are going to work to protect runaways from that law, the fugitive slave law. They're going to warn slaves away. They're going to post posters and say, hey, slave catchers are in the area. They're going to hide them. Sometimes they're going to use intimidation and violence, defending runaways with weapons, people they know are runaways, attacking slave hunters, sometimes killing some of them. Just for example, in Syracuse, New York, shortly after the laws passed, some 2,000 people, most of them white, break into the courthouse of the city, and they free runaway slaves. At least one, I should say. Another example happens in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, remember, there's a lot of Quakers who, by and large, are abolitionists, and they team up with black abolitionists, and they arm themselves and they confront slave hunters. One of these slave owners is killed and his son is severely wounded. Now, this is getting out of hand. You done made the Quakers so angry that they're killing people, or at least it seems so. We don't really know what happened, but charges are dropped because much of the public is on their side. Now, this doesn't always work out in favor of the slaves. The efforts to thwart the fugitive slave law are sometimes overcome by the authorities. In some states, they send out the militia who will intervene to actually put the mob down that is trying to protect a slave. Sometimes the federal government intervenes. For example, in Boston, there's a man named Anthony Burns who is captured, and he's put into the jail. 50,000, that's 50, 50,000 protesters hit the streets of Boston to oppose the capture of Anthony Burns. Anthony Burns is going to be escorted back to slavery by U.S. troops, and amidst this howling mob of people, right? Now, Burns is later going to be freed because abolitionists, white and black, this brings attention to the issue, so people come out of pocket. So they actually pay for Anthony Burns's freedom. So amidst all the turmoil, what we see is ordinary folk standing up, right? So you see abolitionists standing up, but you also see people like Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe famously writes the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, and this is a very sorrowful, brutal tale about slavery and slave catchers. It is directed to the fugitive slave law. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe was a woman. I think she had like 5 kids. She had a handful. She had like 5 kids, and she would put the kids to bed, and then she would write by candlelight. Of course, candlelight, 1852. She would write at night, and she electrifies the North with her sorrowful tale in opposition to the fugitive slave law. She sells like 300,000 copies. That's a lot of copies back in the day. That's a lot, considering the size of the population, considering that not a lot of people not everybody opposed slavery. And so that's a lot. And considering that not everybody can read back then. So in fact, what would happen is that 300,000 copies probably means that more people heard the story because people would sometimes read to each other. Books were written to be read to others. That's what was called the lecture, right? Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to raise the stakes. Opposition to the fugitive slave law skyrockets because she offers a very powerful religious and emotional appeal. And her main character is a guy named Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom is a devout Christian. He is steadfast in his resistance. He is considered to be someone who will always raise, he will lift his head in the face of adversity. Now, today, the term Uncle Tom has taken on a different meaning among black folk, a lot of them, not all. I've heard like my black friends calling each other Uncle Tom, and that term is usually reserved for a black person who maybe is seen as kowtowing to white folk or being overly the word I have is solicitous. What's an easier word? Being sort of overly willing to appease white people to win their favor. That's what becomes known as an Uncle Tom. Now, it didn't start out that way because Uncle Tom in Harriet Beecher Stowe's. Somebody's outside my window yelling. Hang on one second, neighbors. Hang on. Okay, I'm back. Looks like my neighbors were locked out and they were yelling for somebody. I don't know. And anyway, no big deal. So, what was I saying? So Harriet Beecher Stowe, right, creates this character, Uncle Tom. Uncle Tom has taken on a whole different meaning. In the years after the Civil War, the reason that Uncle Tom takes on a different meaning is because a lot of white performers would walk around in blackface and calling themselves Uncle Tom, and they would be acting really silly and ridiculous and kowtowing, to white folk and, doing the whole shuck and jive kind of thing. That would be stereotypical of a black person at the time. Anyway, a little off track there. The point is, Uncle Tom's Cabin, this brutal tale of slave catching, is going to be so important. It's going to electrify the North so much so that legend has it that Lincoln, later on when the war starts, Lincoln meets Harriet Beecher Stowe and reportedly says to her, "So you're the little lady who started this great war." Now, he probably didn't say that. But what's interesting is that that story gets actually spread around. So it shows, in fact, how her book was received at the time. It made its mark. So the Fugitive Slave Law, part of the Compromise of 1850, inflames anti-slavery sentiment. The Compromise on its own of 1850 inflames a lot of people. And embedded in all of this, of course, is an irony about the states' rights issue. If, in fact, Southerners really cared about states' rights, then why is it that they're using the federal government's power to reach into the North to, in fact, abridge the northern rights of the rights of northern states and the rights of northern individuals who are being deputized? So the states' rights argument doesn't seem to work, but it's something that you still hear today. And here in Texas, a lot of people still believe in the states' rights argument, or the states' rights sort of, let's just say argument, as being the cause of the Civil War. The thing about the Compromise of 1850, particularly the Fugitive Slave Law, is that a lot of people see the law as endangering the entire nation, not just the South. So they're afraid that slavery will spread northward, because here the federal government is reaching into the North at the behest of the South. And at the height of the uproar over the Fugitive Slave Law and about, and the concerns about whether slavery endangers the whole nation, there's going to be a new concern, and that is the territories taken from Mexico. Actually misspoke. It's actually the territories that encompass, that are within, I should say, what used to be the Louisiana Territory. What we're looking at here is a conflict on the Great Plains over what becomes known as the Kansas-Nebraska Territory. This is territory that is part of the Louisiana Purchase. So excuse me, I misspoke. Excuse me. But at this time, what's going to happen in this territory is reminiscent of what happened with the territory in the Mexican Cession, right? The Utah Territory, the New Mexico Territory. In 1852, a new bill is introduced in Congress. The bill is actually supposed to break up the Kansas-Nebraska area, which is one territory, into two separate territories. And the idea was to allow popular sovereignty in this area with regard to slavery. So under this bill, it would be up to the people to decide whether slavery should exist in that area. Now, this is attractive to a lot of people. They had already done it with the Mexican territory. It's also attractive because there's this idea of democracy that we like. Well, leave it up to the people to vote on this issue. But there's a problem here, and I hope you've caught it. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that territory is above the Missouri Compromise line. That Louisiana territory, which had been cut in half, sort of, not really half, but which had been bisected, right, by the Missouri territory, now may be open to slavery. Remember, Mexico was already subject, or the territory taken from Mexico was already open to popular sovereignty. The South wants more of the same. But the Missouri Compromise line had been for a very long time been considered sacred. The final statement on slavery there. People are gonna go nuts. They're like, wait a minute, you done took Texas. You done got what you wanted, what Calhoun wanted in the Utah, New Mexico territory with regard to popular sovereignty. Now you want to go back on the compromise that you made in 1820? So there's going to be this huge backlash. There are going to be these impassioned speeches in Congress. People are going to talk about in Congress the criminal betrayal of precious rights. Some call for compromise. A lot of people are fearing war. Abolitionist societies are swelling in numbers because of this bill. A firestorm of protests erupts in the streets. Tens of thousands of people rally in the North and the West. The fugitive slave law conflict looks small by comparison. People are saying that the South is trying to force slavery onto people who want freedom, especially the free soilers who want a free West. Well, the bill passes. And what we have is the Nebraska Territory and the Kansas Territory being created, and popular sovereignty now being acceptable or being the way to go in these territories. So as of this point, if we take a look, the green, free states and territories, the blue, slave states, and that orangey brown looking, that burnt orange looking stuff, all that area now is open to popular sovereignty on the slavery issue. This Kansas-Nebraska Act, when it's passed in 1854, will cause deeper divisions. Tensions are running hot in Congress. In Congress, a guy named Senator Charles Sumner, he gives this impassioned speech, and he talks about how the Kansas-Nebraska Act is a crime against Kansas. Sumner denounces slavery. He denounces all Democrats because they are the party of slavery. And he denounces anyone who supports slavery or the Democrats. He goes so far as to accuse a fellow senator, a guy named Butler, by the way, of voting for the bill, the Kansas-Nebraska bill, just so that this senator can own slaves and have sex with them. So they're getting kind of dirty with it. Well, Charles Sumner, who gives the speech about the crime against Kansas and actually calls out a fellow senator, is going to become a target. The senator that he was talking badly about, he has a cousin, a guy named Preston Brooks, whatever. This guy enters the Senate chambers where Sumner is sitting behind the desk. And what does he do? Excuse me. I should have actually posted this before. So Charles Sumner is the senator who talks about the crime against Kansas. He accuses a fellow senator of voting for a pro-slavery bill just so that slavery can spread and so that that senator can have easy access to slave women for sexual purposes. Again, that senator has a cousin who goes into the chambers of the Senate where Charles Sumner is sitting behind the desk, and he just beats the heck out of him. He takes a cane and beats this man bloody. He beats him some 30 times about the head and shoulders with his cane. He kicks the desk on top of him, and he has him there underneath it and just beats him about the head and shoulders. Now, Sumner is actually hurt by this seriously. For the rest of his life, he really can't talk right, and he can't really drink without like dribbling out the side of his mouth. It's really unfortunate. And here's the thing. Congress, a lot of Southerners, I should say, they rally to Brooks' side. They buy him new canes. A lot of Southerners will send him new canes. This guy, by the way, was a senator himself, and he wins re-election in South Carolina. Charles Sumner is the victim here, right? But this guy, Preston Brooks, if you care to know his name, Charles Sumner is important. This guy who canes him, he's getting praised all around by Southerners, buying him new canes. After the beating of Sumner in the Senate chambers, congressmen begin carrying weapons inside of Congress. Now, of course, there's a lot of Congress people today who would be okay with that. There's a lot of them who aren't. Now, you might have seen in the news lately how, after the January 6, 2021 riots at the Capitol, when they tried to take the Capitol, Congress started restricting Congress people even more. They had to pass through special metal detectors and so forth, and people were trying to get around it, and they were talking about the Second Amendment rights and so forth. So they were actually carrying guns back in the day. So meanwhile, right? So there's this fallout here, but meanwhile, back in this Kansas-Nebraska area, you're going to see a lot of people swarming in, especially into Kansas. You're going to see a lot of people who are crossing over from Missouri, right? That little blue area there to the right of Kansas, and flowing into the Kansas territory. Their whole goal is to create a slave state. Even more free state people swarm in from the north. Remember, there are more Northerners than there are Southerners in terms of sheer population. But it's not just that. Abolitionist societies, they see the writing on the wall, and they want to keep Kansas free. And so a lot of abolitionist societies raise money to pay for anti-slavery settlers to go out to Kansas. They will pay for your transportation. They will pay for your land. All you got to do when you get out there is vote for freedom. Remember, it's about bodies, voters. It's about popular sovereignty. What happens, though, is that the pro-slavery forces are going to be outnumbered by the northern anti-slavery forces, and they're going to turn to violence. These border ruffians, as they're called, the ones that are coming over across the border from Missouri, they're actually outnumbered. And so they're going to turn to violence. And the anti-slavery forces, those people who don't want slavery in Kansas, they're going to respond in kind. You're going to see free soilers and abolitionists joining forces like never before because they want to keep Kansas free. Free soilers don't really have any moral issues with slavery. Abolitionists, of course, often do, not always, but you're going to see free soilers and abolitionists join forces. They're going to call for men to fight for freedom in the West. These men that goes, he's not a border ruffian. Remember, the border ruffians are the Missourians that come over the border and want slave state Kansas. It is the free soilers and the abolitionists that are fighting them, calling on more men to come to fight for freedom in the West. Enter a man named Jown Brown. Jown Brown is a white man from New England, and this guy hates slavery more than any other white man, probably before or since. He's a deep believer in the Declaration of Independence. He is disgusted with slavery. He's a passionate, even violent abolitionist. He's already helped escape slaves. He's helped free them. He's already resisted the fugitive slave law with violence. So this guy in 1855, he goes to Kansas to join his sons. His two sons had been there already. They had gone there to settle. They had gone there to see Kansas become a free state. Now Kansas they have been actually fighting for a few years in Kansas, and they call on Jown Brown for help. He wants to protect his family. He wants to fight slavery. And he's going to get his chance shortly after his arrival. Shortly after his arrival in 1856, he is going to actually, with his sons, seek revenge for an attack on a small town in Kansas. A small town called Lawrence had been sacked by pro-slavery forces. So Lawrence, in fact, was a pretty hotbed of abolitionism and anti-slave and free soilers, right? Abolitionists and free soilers. Well, pro-slavery forces knew this, and so what did they do? They sack the city, they burn buildings, they loot stores, they beat up residents. So Jown Brown and his sons want revenge for this. So 2 days after the attack on Lawrence, Kansas, Jown Brown and his sons, they sneak up on a small encampment of pro-slavery families. They're camped on the edge of the Pottawatomie River, or Creek. Pottawatomie Creek, I think it is, but it's Pottawatomie. Well, these families, there's like 5 of them, they're not the ones who sacked Lawrence, but they are pro-slavery. So Jown Brown and his sons, they wake these 5 families up from sleep, and without much more thought, they murder and mutilate like 5 men. They just hack them to death with these broadswords. Now they leave the wives and the children to spread the news. Don't come to Kansas unless you want freedom in Kansas. Now the Pottawatomie Massacre, as it's called, makes a name for Jown Brown as a fierce anti-slavery fighter, a champion for what he calls the manhood of the Negro race. In fact, it is in Kansas where he proclaims the manhood of the Negro race. And this is huge because this is a white man who's from New England, and he comes from a good family in terms of wealth and so forth. He's talking about the manhood of the Negro race. And he begins to plan the overthrow of the federal government after the Pottawatomie Massacre. So he makes a name for himself, and he begins to plot the overthrow of the government. Meanwhile, the Pottawatomie Massacre is also provoking more brutal guerrilla warfare than before. People are living in fear. There are hundreds of deaths. In fact, Bleeding Kansas, as it's called, will last all the way through the Civil War. So what are the consequences of the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Well, the Missouri Compromise line is gone. That line, which had been considered sacred, is gone. Now, the territories in that area and the ones that were taken from Mexico are open to slavery. This is going to ignite violence in the territories, but something else happens. A new political party is born, the Republican Party. The Republican Party will be the first major party to take a moral stand on the issue of slavery. The first major party. There were other parties like the Liberty Party that came before that is still there, but which was not a major party. The Republican Party will become a major party. So there were others that took a moral stand, but they weren't major. This is the first major party to take a moral stand on the issue of slavery. Now, they do say that slavery is okay where it exists, but it should be kept from spreading because it is immoral. They're very much like the Free Soilers, except for the moral position that they have. The Free Soilers, remember, don't take a moral position on it. Some people would say it's a selfish position, white manism, and so forth. The Republican Party is taking a moral position. Now, I should tell you, this is not the Republican Party of today. I'm going to say more about this later on, but the Republican Party of today is conservative. The Republican Party at this time would be what would be considered liberal for the time. The Republican, and we're going to talk more about that. The Republican Party is a purely northern party. Purely northern party. Not like today, right? It's purely northern. It opposes the Democratic Party, right? Which is the party of slavery. Now, the Democrats are spread north and south, but by this time they begin splitting over the issue of slavery. And in fact, a lot of those people who splinter off the Democratic Party over the issue of slavery will flow into the Republican Party. Because even though they're Democrats, they oppose the slavery issue. A lot of these people had already flowed into the Free Soil Party too, probably more so. The thing is, the Republican Party draws a multitude of people, white and black. Even Frederick Douglass joins. He sees the Republican, yes, it's a halfway measure because they're okay with slavery where it exists, they say, but it's something he can work with. Remember, he was good with the Free Soil Party, which didn't take a moral position. Now he has a party that is taking a moral position. That's the main difference between these parties. Now, the Republican Party is going to run a presidential candidate in 1856. Now, this guy does not win, but he makes a strong showing. After this strong showing in the presidential election of 1856 by the Republicans, white Southerners are going to be convinced more than ever that Northerners are hostile to slavery wherever it exists. Remember, the Republican Party is a Northern party. So when he makes a good showing, this convinces the Southerners that Northerners want to end slavery wherever it exists. Southerners reason it this way. Okay, Republicans, your objection to slavery is moral. If it's moral in the West and in the North, why wouldn't it be immoral here? So I don't believe you. If you think it's immoral, you're not going to just stop there and say we want to stop the spread of it. Eventually, you're going to come for us. We know what you want. You want to end slavery everywhere. And so a lot of white Southerners will fear that the party, the Republican Party, may be the future of the nation, that it will end slavery if it gains control of government. And in fact, a lot of people are flowing into the Republican Party because they believe just that. By this time, the Union is on the verge of cracking over the issue of slavery. And just when we've reached this point, the nation encounters a series of new crises, one more serious than the last. These two people are Dred Scott and Harriet Scott. Dred Scott had been born a slave. And as an adult, he is taken to the state of Illinois and the territory of Wisconsin. So what? Well, the state of Illinois and the territory of Wisconsin are free when he's taken there. Okay. Well, he goes there and he marries a slave woman named Harriet. Now, both of these people are illiterate. They can't read or write, but they're not stupid. Both of these people save money to try to buy their freedom. They live in Missouri as slaves. And the law in Missouri had outlawed hiring out. You may remember hiring out, where slaves will do their own thing, make some money on the side. Missouri had outlawed hiring out, but it's still done. Like all laws, enforcement is going to be a problem. And not everybody wants to enforce this law because even the slave owner gets a piece of what the slave makes on the side as he's being hired out. Point being, they save money to try to buy their own freedom, but time and again, they're denied their own self-purchase. Harriet eventually convinces Dred, look, we should sue for our own freedom. So she knows something. She knows that there had been a lot of freedom suits. You remember these freedom suits? And there had been a lot of them in Missouri. For a long time, Missouri had followed the principle, Missouri courts had followed the principle of once free, always free. And that means that if a slave was taken to the Northwest Territory, which is exactly where he had gone, if a slave was taken to the Northwest Territory, he was free, even if returned. Missouri courts were upholding these freedom suits, and they called it once free, always free. But there's a problem by the time Dred Scott sues for his freedom. Missouri has a new state Supreme Court. You know that each state has a Supreme Court, and of course we have the United States Supreme Court, which is a supreme over all the country. But each state has its own Supreme Court. This Supreme Court will in fact overturn the once free, always free doctrine. That's not going to be anymore. It's more conservative than it was. So, courts change the law all the time. One of the reasons that the Supreme Court has and is often a point of contention, it has been and is a point of contention, is that they are the ones that determine. The Supreme Court determines what the law is. The Constitution is one thing and one thing only, what the Supreme Court says it is. So states have the same sort of power within their own states with regard to their own laws. Whatever their state Supreme Court says the law is, that's the law. Well, obviously, there is a higher power, and that is the U.S. Supreme Court. If it gets there, Scott appeals, and his wife, they appeal all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice at this time is a guy named Roger Taney. T-A-N-E-Y. T-A-N-E-Y. Guy on the left, Roger Taney. Roger Taney has the case in front of him. He's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he's going to write the opinion for the majority of the court. And he looks at the nation's history, and he says, well, I'm looking at this history, and I have concluded that this history shows that a black person has, quote, no rights which the white man is bound to respect. No rights which the white man is bound to respect. What evidence does he have? Well, he says black people are inferior. They have no rights. Their rights are not equal to ours. We make the laws. Now, this is reminiscent, of course, of the pro-slavery argument, or at least one of them that we talked about before, inferiority. He goes on to say, not only are black people inferior, but this revolution, which was about freedom, was not about them and not by them. Now, by now, I hope you realize this was wrong also. slaves, black people, right? Generally, these people had their own hopes for the revolution, and some of them fought and died in the revolution. So he's way off on his history. He goes on to say, the U.S. Constitution doesn't include them. When it talks about them at all, pretty much, refers to, and he's talking about black people. When it talks about any kind of black person, he basically says, look, there's slavery, right? The Constitution allows slavery. Now, he says the Constitution wasn't about them, and it wasn't by them, just like the revolution. And he's wrong about this as well, because in fact, in the North, some black people voted up or down on the U.S. Constitution. But I mean, even if these things were true, right? I mean, look at what's happening here. What he's saying is that these people are not citizens, that black people have been left out of the term American. Right from the beginning, the history books, the court cases are leaving them out. They're not part of the fabric. In short, what he is saying about this case is that courts don't have to acknowledge any right by black people to sue. They have no rights which the white man is bound to respect. So he's like, I don't even know why we're here. He's talking about black people generally, not just slaves. Now, he could have stopped here after doing all this damage. He goes on, and he actually makes a very dramatic change in how the nation views slavery. He crafts this new way, this new law, in a sense. What he says, and again, this is going beyond the issue of whether or not Dred Scott and his wife were in fact still slaves. He's already dealt with that issue wrongly, but he's dealt with it. He goes on to say, all federal laws that deprive a person of their property in slaves is unconstitutional. What does this mean? Any federal law that takes away a person's property in slaves is no law at all. It's unconstitutional. Because the Fifth Amendment protects property, slaves are property. And he says you don't lose your ownership of your horse by taking him into a free area. This should sound familiar. This also is John Calhoun's argument. He made this argument. Not only did he make the popular sovereignty argument, people should decide, states should decide, but he also said the federal government, and of course, by the way, when Calhoun makes that argument, it's over the territory of Mexico, and he eventually wins that argument with the Compromise of 1850. Or at least he gets his way. Here he gets his way again in a Supreme Court decision. Hopefully you can begin to understand why a lot of Northerners believe this is all a part of the slave power conspiracy. Now, if we look back to see the laws that existed before, we can judge them according to what he just said. Laws such as the Northwest Ordinance, those are unconstitutional. The Missouri Compromise, unconstitutional, because what it did was deprive people of slave property in the northern states. Those were federal laws. The Northwest Ordinance, the Missouri Compromise, those are federal laws that said no slavery above these lines. Well, those were never good laws. Naturally, Northerners are horrified. They believe that slavery threatens the entire nation. At the same time, you have to think the federal government is supporting slavery, but it can't end slavery. It's supporting slavery through the fugitive slave law, for example, but it can't work to end slavery. States' liberty laws have fallen already. So what do we make of the South's states' rights argument? Northerners are crying foul, and they're saying the South is hypocritical because of Dred Scott, because of the fugitive slave law, because the state rights of Northerners are under attack. And so they scream about the slave power conspiracy. In fact, they say, look, the Supreme Court, all but one of these guys is a Southerner. They're almost all Southerners, and some of them are slaveholders. So that's part of the slave power conspiracy. You were listening to the arguments of people like John C. Calhoun. They also look at the presidency, and they say, okay, they see, I should say, that the president at the time, a guy named Buchanan, whatever, he jumps in immediately after this decision, and he tells the nation, just accept it. But this guy was a pro-slavery person, right? He had a pro-slavery stance. After the Dred Scott decision, white people are streaming into the Republican Party. They see that the presidency has been taken in their eyes by the slave power conspiracy, that the Supreme Court has been taken in their eyes by the slave power conspiracy. The only way to change things is through Congress. You get out and you vote. They hope somehow to change it via politics, so they stream into the Republican Party. Remember, many of these people are anti-Black. They just don't want slavery. They fear for their own freedoms. Of course, a lot of them, many of them, are very well-meaning folk who want slavery to end for moral reasons. So a lot of white folk are flowing into the party. Black folk too, but a lot of Black folk are saying, look, we don't owe loyalty to a nation that does not consider them to be, they said, if you don't consider me an American, quote unquote, right, a citizen, right, we're not citizens, I have no rights that a white man is bound to respect, then why should I stay here? A lot of them leave to Canada. Some of them go to Liberia. A lot of them talk about setting up their own nation outside the United States, where they're not going to really be, they're not going to be in Africa. They said, we could do this anywhere. They say, we're not really welcome here. We are not American. But they believe in this idea of self-determination. They've come to realize at some level that they are a nation of people within a nation of people. And that outer nation, by and large, does not want them there. So they start to say, we need to do our own thing. Of course, most of them stay here and they work to fight the good fight. So Northerners are aghast. Southerners are thrilled. They believe that the Supreme Court has guaranteed the future of slavery in all of the United States. They say free states can't do anything about it now. The Supreme Court has spoken, and we have popular sovereignty going on in these other territories. Things are looking good. After the Dred Scott decision, in fact, Southerners, a lot of them call for the repeal of the 1808 law banning the international slave trade. Let's back up a little. You may remember, as part of the Dirty Compromise, Congress was banned from ending the international slave trade until about 1808. Well, in fact, Congress does stop it in 1808 after the 20-year time period lapses. They do stop the international slave trade. But now, because of the Dred Scott decision, a lot of Southerners are saying that is not good law, because this is a federal law that takes away my interest in selling my property or buying property across the U.S. border. Point being, these people are thrilled. Meanwhile, by the way, the Dred Scott, the person, he draws a lot of attention to himself. He gets a lot of good attention, and he's bought away from his owner. I think his wife too. I should check that out. But I know he's bought away from his owner and then freed. His new owner buys him, frees him. Unfortunately, he dies a year later. So, but he does get a year of freedom. And I listened to a podcast on this a while ago, and they were interviewing the families of Roger Taney, the Supreme Court Justice, the descendants, I should say. and the descendants of Dred Scott. And it was just very fascinating. You had these white people who were descended from Taney feeling guilty. The descendant of Dred Scott was apologized to by the descendant of Roger Taney. And the descendant of Dred Scott felt horrible about the apology. He said, this guy didn't do anything to me. But the other guy feels it's in his, not that it's in his blood, but he feels somehow beholden to this person who is descended from the other guy. It's just amazing how history is still with us and how these feelings can be really sort of dredged up. So the descendant of Dred Scott is like, I don't feel right accepting your apology. He didn't know what to do with it, right? It'd be rude if he doesn't, but it's just like, well, if I do, it's just like saying that you did something wrong. And man, you didn't do anything to me. And it's just so fascinating how these things still affect our lives today when we stop and think about them. I should also tell you one more thing about the Dred Scott decision, is that it convinces Jown Brown that a final reckoning is coming. Remember, he's been planning to strike the government for some time already. He believes that only violence is going to end slavery. Slavery can be overthrown not by talk, not by the government, but only through force. He says, the Dred Scott decision shows that the slave power conspiracy controls government, and it controls the political future of the nation. Meanwhile, Bleeding Kansas is still going on, right? And by this time, he's already been called a murderer because of his actions there. He's under attack. He's actually a wanted man. And when he's accused of, being a murderer, he says, because of what happened at Potawatomi and so forth, he says, look, I acted in the line of duty. He says, I must pursue it. And he goes on to say that he will do so even if it destroys him and his family. And he says, I'm guided by God. We've heard this before, right? Nat Turner. He says, I'm guided by God. And he says, look at what's happening in Bleeding Kansas right now. All that fighting has paid off because it looks like Kansas will enter as a free state after all, because by this time, violence has kept Kansas free. So he says, violence is the only way. And by the way, Kansas will enter as a state in 1861 as a free state. Point is, Brown is hyped up, and a lot of people have come to agree with him. They say the nation was had built slavery into the fabric of the country. And so how can you uproot that? Just so it's going to take a wrenching. If it is built into the fabric, if it is part and parcel of the thing, the entity, and that's how it was built. Remember the Constitution and the Dirty Compromise. How is it that you can simply change things? People say no. By this time, politicians have avoided direct confrontation on the issue of slavery. Every time it comes up, it's compromise after compromise after compromise. And even by now, Abraham Lincoln has already stated that, quote, there is no peaceful extinction of slavery in prospect for us. He believes that already. By the time in 1859 that Jown Brown launches his attack at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. This plan was to take the arsenal. And this is a federal arsenal. This is where weapons are stored by the federal government. He says, we're going to take the arsenal. We're going to arm the slaves with those weapons, because these slaves, as soon as they hear what we're doing, they're going to rise up and strike out for their own freedom. We will all melt into the mountains and launch attacks on the slave power and destroy it. So he leads these 18 men, black and white, 3 of his sons, and he takes the arsenal, but then he tries to fight his way out. Man, there's no way. He's outmanned and he's outgunned. The townsfolk surround him. The militia comes out. The U.S. military. He engages in this firefight with people who are laying siege to Harper's Ferry. Two of his sons are actually killed in this battle. One of them dies at his side, so the story goes, dies at his side, and he keeps fighting. But he finally surrenders, and he surrenders rather ironically to a man named Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee will be a Civil War general, right? A lot of you know this. At this time, it's still the Union. He's a Union officer. I think he's a colonel. I'm not sure. I don't know a lot about military history, I have to tell you. But Robert E. Lee, right, takes him into custody. You know, Brown never freed a single slave. No slaves rose up to help. He loses like 8 men, a couple of sons, and then he's tried for treason. So why do we talk about him? You know, while in jail, he says, I go joyfully. He's talking about his impending death. I go joyfully on behalf of millions. And I read this because I go joyfully on behalf of millions that have no rights that this great and glorious, this Christian country is bound to respect. I go joyfully on behalf of millions that have no rights that this great and glorious, this Christian country is bound to respect. Now, he's pulling at several strings here, right? He's pulling the Christian card. He's talking about the greatness of the nation. And he's referring to the Dred Scott decision. No rights. Moments before his death, he says that he's certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. Then he's hanged. What's the significance of this? The raid on Harper's Ferry sends shockwaves throughout the nation. Southerners are incensed. They point to the Republican Party and they say, look, you're just like Brown. You are anti-slavery. He was anti-slavery. You're determined to end slavery everywhere. I know you are, because if you're moral on this issue, you know, morality doesn't stop at the water's edge, so to speak. It doesn't stop at the frontier, right, of a state. You want to end it everywhere, just like Brown. And so they say Brown and the Republican Party were all part of this Black Republican conspiracy to end slavery in the South, maybe even give Black people equal rights. So the Southerners are mad as hell. They're driving Northerners out of the South because they believe that all Northerners cannot be trusted. They're all Republicans. Then all Northerners are Republicans and all Republicans are Jown Brown. That's how they see it. Now, most Northerners are afraid of what's happening. A lot of them stand up and they denounce Brown. They're like, oh, no, we're not him. Even Abraham Lincoln, who's a congressman at this time, he calls him a traitor. He calls Jown Brown a traitor to the nation. Remember, this is a federal arsenal that he took. And a lot of people in the North will hold mass meetings. And in these mass meetings, they openly declare that they oppose Jown Brown's methods. And all of this, of course, is to appease the South. But many Northerners applaud Brown, especially Black Northerners. For a lot of people, he's seen as a martyr, someone who died for the cause. Frederick Douglass, for example, he praises Jown Brown. Jown Brown, he says, well, Frederick Douglass, let me rephrase. Frederick Douglass says, I live for the slave. Jown Brown dies for the slave. In fact, Jown Brown had wanted Frederick Douglass to join him in this battle. Frederick Douglass was like, nope, that's a suicide mission. In fact, Jown Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was an open secret in some circles of the North, and in fact, financed by some wealthy people of the North. The point is, he is the one that's hanged, and so he becomes the martyr. In fact, on the day that he's hanged, church bells ring across the North, and he will be known in a lot of circles as a hero of the American Revolution. the American Revolution, because people are saying that this fight, his fight, was an extension of the American Revolution, the purity of principle of equality and freedom. In some sense, the American Revolution is not yet over. If the American Revolution is about freedom and equality, here in 1859, that hasn't happened. So a lot of people say he's a revolutionary. This, of course, is going to anger the South, right? And it makes a decision. They see that a lot of Northerners support what Brown did. They're thinking all Northerners are Republicans and all Republicans are Jown Browns. They believe that the North will use violence to end slavery. The Harper's Ferry raid, the supporters in the North, the Republicans, they're all the enemy. And so what do? The South begins to build a Southern army. And they state clearly, very clearly, if a Republican wins the presidential election of 1860, we are out of here. We will secede from the Union. So the stage is pretty well set. Southerners have sort of drawn a line in the dirt saying, if you cross this, we're leaving. If a Republican wins the 1860 election, we will secede from the Union. Okay, well, in the 1860 election, we have, of course, this guy named Abraham Lincoln. Hannibal Hamlin, I never remember that guy's name. Whatever. The point is this. Lincoln is chosen by the Republican Party. Why? Well, he is a skilled debater. He also has this image about him, about being a common man, right? Born in a log cabin. Right? There's this idea that he was a rail splitter, meaning someone who uses an axe to split logs, which is very, very difficult. If you've ever done this, you know that. He probably never really split many logs in his life, but he does have this image about him, the image of the common man, and the idea that the common man should be a force in politics is still very strong because of Andrew Jackson, the Jacksonian era of right around 1830. So he's a skilled debater. He's got this common man image, but here, very importantly, is another thing, and that is that he is very moderate on the issue of slavery. He's a middle of the roader in a sense. He says, I don't believe in equal rights for Black people. Obviously, he's a very complicated man, as we'll see. He says, I don't believe in equal rights, but he does detest slavery. He says, all men deserve to be paid for their labor. And he meant, all people. He's already, of course, by now, though, said, as I mentioned before, that's the only way slavery is going to end is through violence. So he's kind of complicated. The South sees all of this, right? And they're wary of this election. If he wins, they see it as a victory for an anti-slavery platform that is destined in their minds to end slavery wherever it exists. Specifically, of course, we're talking about the South. So in the 1860 election, Lincoln pretty much sweeps all the northern states, except New Jersey, by the way. So he pretty much takes them all. In the South, he doesn't even appear on 10 ballots of the South, meaning 10 states. 10 states don't even put his name on the ballot, so you can't even vote for him unless you write him in, I suppose. Lincoln still wins the election. Interestingly, he wins with only 40% of the popular vote. Now, to win the presidential election, you don't need to win 50% plus, right? You just need to win more than the other guy. And that's what he does. He wins more than the other guy in terms of electoral votes. Electoral votes, of course, are based on population and the number of senators, right? So we don't need to go into that. It's more of a government thing. I teach government, but here's the thing. He wins with only 40% of the popular vote. And the significance of this, in part, is that the South has spoken. They're not going to accept a Republican. They don't vote for him. Yeah, he wins because of the larger population and the larger number of electoral votes in the North. But the South will not accept a Republican, and they make that statement. And in fact, after his win, the South will begin to secede. South Carolina is going to be the first of the southern states to leave. They proclaim, hey, we are no longer bound by the U.S. Constitution. So they're cutting ties with the United States. And this is going to prompt a period or a sort of, a phenomenon called secessionitis, where state after state after state in the South will secede. But of course, as I said, this happens, pretty rapidly. And by the way, South Carolina leaves before Abraham Lincoln is even seated as president. They don't wait. The South begins to form its own government. They set up what's known as the Confederate States of America, the CSA, Confederate States of America, where they set up a president, they set up a vice president. They begin, of course, to craft their own constitution. When the South secedes, we have a beginning here. And what a lot of people call this is the beginning of the Second American Revolution. Of course, they do that in retrospect. Looking back, we can say this. And you may wonder, well, why is this a Second American Revolution? I might even argue that it's simply a continuation of the American Revolution, though. Because if the American Revolution was based on these lofty principles, as we've noted before, based on the idea of liberty and equality, well, we're not there as of 1860. But the Civil War is going to get us closer to that. So a lot of historians will call this the Second American Revolution. So let's take a moment to step back a bit and ask ourselves, why did the South secede? Why don't they even wait for Lincoln's inauguration to see what he says, to see whether he's going to make good on his promise? He has said already, I don't want to mess with slavery where it exists. I just don't want it to spread westward. Now, he said this, but they're not going to believe him. They're not going to wait. So why do they secede? Well, when people tell you who they are, you should believe them. All we have to do is look at their actions, their words. In fact, South Carolina, which is the first to secede, tells us why they leave. And other states in the South will also tell us why they leave. And basically, they're all the same reasons. Let's just look really quickly at South Carolina's declaration. They issue a declaration that they call the Declaration on the Immediate Causes of Secession. Declaration of the Immediate Causes of Secession. And if you read this thing, you will see that their reason for leaving is slavery. They believe that the North threatens slavery, that the North flouts the fugitive slave law. Right? They ignore it. Not only do they ignore it, but they work against it. They look at how the North condemns slavery, how the North condemns the South. how a lot of people in the North are abolitionists, how over time there has been violence levied against Southerners, slave rebellions, Jown Brown, Bleeding Kansas. And to make things worse, in the minds of these people, you elected Lincoln, who, in the minds of Southerners, is devoted to the ending of slavery. So if you read the Declaration on the immediate causes of secession of South Carolina and others like it, you will see these trends. Yeah, they talk about doing their own thing with regard to states' rights, but all of that revolves around slavery. Yeah, they talk about states' rights, but they use states' rights for their own benefit. If they were purists on the states' rights issue, then they would not justify, they would not support even federal abuse of northern state laws as the Northerners see it. They're not purists when it comes to the states' rights argument. In fact, the states' rights argument is really a smokescreen. It's really, in fact, a vehicle for getting what they want, and that is the success of slavery, the protection of it, the expansion of it. When they set up their new government, they set up a constitution. It's called the Constitution of the Confederate States of America. And this constitution is interesting because it's nearly identical to the United States Constitution. But there are a couple important differences. One of the things that this constitution says is that slavery is guaranteed in all states of the Confederate States of America. It's guaranteed in all the states. If you are a member of the CSA, slavery is guaranteed. Not just in the states, but any territories that they might take. Notice they have their eyes on territory. In fact, by this time, they have their eyes on the Caribbean, Mexico. They want these areas to actually make them into slave states as part of the Confederacy. So what do we see here? No state or territory can outlaw slavery. What does this tell us about the states' rights argument? You have a constitution that in fact doesn't allow a single state to decide on the slavery question. What does this say about their support not only for states' rights, but the idea of popular sovereignty, where the people should decide? More and more by now, I think you should be seeing that the states' rights argument is not workable for various reasons. Now, interestingly, this is kind of an aside, but interestingly, the CSA Constitution has built within it well, it's not really an aside. It is important. It has built within it a clause that outlaws the international slave trade. It outlaws the international slave trade, which is kind of interesting because you might look at this and say, oh, well, that's a good thing with regard to, taking a step, I suppose, to modernity, right? Toward being a more modern, progressive nation. They outlaw the international slave trade. Meanwhile, they're doing all these other things, right? So be careful. But we have to interrogate this a little bit more. Why is it that they outlaw the international slave trade? Well, basically, it's because they want alliances with countries like England, France. England is a big one. Remember, England and France have outlawed slavery by now. So they have their particular view of it. If you, as an up-and-coming nation, are wanting to make friends with people who are anti-slavery, then you have to give a little bit. Now, they're still probably going to deal with you, right, if you own slaves. but they might not deal with you, or that you might have conflict with them if you engage in the international slave trade, particularly Britain. Why? Because Britain still has the largest navy in the world, and the largest ship squadron within that navy is on the high seas, making sure that people are not captured from Africa and enslaved. You might remember that after England after England outlaws the international slave trade, it goes a step further and creates this slave squadron, or this anti-slave trading squadron on the high seas, to board ships of all sorts that are transporting human cargo. So the CSA doesn't want to get involved in that, doesn't want to have any conflict on the high seas with a power like England. In fact, it wants England as a friend. And the other thing is this: slaves are reproducing naturally now. They're reproducing naturally. Why would you want to buy new slaves off of, from Africa, particularly slaves that are not seasoned? So when we step back here, what we're seeing is that the Confederate States of America, the Confederacy, was built as a slave society. Not just a society with slaves, but a slave society, a society that is based upon the holding of humans in bondage. It's in their Constitution, right? And it says it can never be outlawed. It goes further than the US Constitution with regard to slavery. So look at their documents, right? Their articles of secession. Look at the Constitution of the Confederate States. Also look at public statements. A lot of Southerners at this point, as secession is happening, as all of this is, it's very dynamic in a sense because everything's happening quickly. While all of this is happening, Southerners are claiming that secession is really just the continuing struggle of the American Revolution. So it's interesting how both sides actually claim the American Revolution as their own. On the one hand, you can take the Northern perspective and say, this is a continuation of the American Revolution because the American Revolution stopped short of actually recognizing freedom and equality. And we're just continuing that fight. On the other hand, you could take the Southern point of view, I suppose, which is a people who are truly independent will do what they want. And not only that, there are people like George Fitzhugh. This is one of those guys that bandied about, this whole pro-slavery argument. You might remember his name from before. Don't worry about his name. Here's the thing. Notable Southerners are saying things like him, and he says that secession is actually more significant. It's more important than the American Revolution, which he calls, by the way, a commonplace affair. He's really downplaying the revolution. He says the revolution was about overthrowing tyranny, and that's what we're doing. So we're revolutionaries. But then he goes on to say, secession is actually going beyond that. Not only are we overthrowing tyranny, but we are fighting against the idea of human equality. We're fighting against the idea of human equality. So notable Confederates are saying this, Southerners. But they go on. A guy named Alexander Stephens is the vice president of the CSA. Alexander Stephens, I think, puts it better than anyone. He just puts it out there. He says that our new government, right, the Confederate States of America, are founded upon exactly the opposite ideas, meaning the ideas of the American Revolution. He says that our new government has its foundations laid, has a cornerstone, right? And this cornerstone is the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery is his natural condition, his moral condition, that's where he belongs. He says, our new government is the first in the history of the world based upon this great idea, this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. So don't give me states' rights. Now, you could, of course, still argue states' rights if you want, but I think it's going to be very difficult. In fact, I don't know any historians who believe in the states' rights theory anymore. That's an old theory, and we're going to get to why that is in terms of at least why so many people believed it, but a lot of people still believe it, the states' rights theory. Here in Texas, it's very difficult to tell older folk that the Civil War was actually about slavery. A lot of people like to believe in the states' rights argument. I still have students like that who will say things, but I've had a lot of students come up to me after the end of the semester and say, yeah, you were right, after having studied all these things. But, you want to argue against it, that's fine. You got to come up with some good stuff, though. Because all I have to do, really, I mean, there's a lot of counter information to such an argument, but really, let's just look at these statements. Let's look at these documents. When people tell you who they are, you should believe them. So the 1860 election really is a final reckoning, right? The Union has been fragile. Now it just snapped. And this election really reflects changes of the past several decades, right? For at least 60 years before 1860. There are social, economic, and political differences and changes. The first American Revolution, right, as we see it, had really stopped short of declaring that all men are created equal. Those are words in the Declaration of Independence. Those are not words in the Constitution. A lot of my students get that wrong. The Constitution does not say all men are created equal. In fact, up to 1860, there's nothing about equality in the U.S. Constitution. That comes later, which we'll talk about. Since the Constitution, and beginning with the Constitution's dirty compromise, the nation has been held together by compromise. You got the dirty compromise, and then, of course, the Northwest Ordinance. We have the Missouri Compromise. We have the Compromise of 1850. And there's been these long-standing divisions between North and South from the very beginning. Different labor systems, different ways of life, separate purposes. And as these areas matured, they grew increasingly apart. Oh, give me 1 second. I have to close my door. They grew increasingly apart, right? The needs, the interests, the values of each was not acceptable to the other. The North was moving toward what it deemed to be a free society, and really they mean one that's unhindered by slavery, free labor, security, right? You don't want to have to worry about slave insurrections. And free speech. I should be able to talk about slavery in the negative if I prefer. I might not want to, but I should be able to. Meanwhile, Southerners, especially Southern planters, are more and more committed to chattel slavery. These planters are committed to their wealth, their status, and it is the basis of their society. And again, even poor white folk accept this. They might be poor, but they're not slaves. And all of these disputes are amplified by the push westward, and of course, the birth of the Republican Party. Know that violence is also a constant reminder to everyone about the place of slavery in the nation. We have rebellions, we have Bleeding Kansas, we have Harper's Ferry. This war will be about slavery. I should say that the war does not start as a Northern effort to end slavery. It doesn't start that way, but it will end that way. It did start because the South could not let slavery go. It assumed that the only way to preserve slavery was to shatter the Union. Lincoln is not going to allow that. When Lincoln assumes office in his inaugural address, he does this even after secession has already begun. There's no war going on yet, right? But secession has happened. He gives his inaugural speech, and he really wishes to soothe the fears of the South. He promises the South that he does not want to interfere with slavery in the areas where it exists, the states that it exists in particular in the South. And he says, I don't even have the authority to end slavery anywhere. So why are you worried? I'm not trying to take your slaves away, is basically what he's saying. But Lincoln will not tolerate secession. He says, I will do all I can to save the Union. Here's where he gives his famous house divided speech, right? He gets biblical on them. He says, a house divided against itself cannot stand. We must remain a union. Lincoln, he inherits a very tough situation. Having trouble technically. Give me one moment. Okay, there it goes. He inherits a very tough situation. Fort Sumter is a Union fort. All of course, the forts are Union. They're at this point, they're all still part of the United States. Nothing has jumped off yet. But Fort Sumter, which is a Union fort, is in South Carolina, which is the heart of Dixieland, the South. Fort Sumter is in the heart of Dixieland, and it is running low on supplies. And it cannot be resupplied without going into territory claimed by the Confederate States of America. If Lincoln decides to send ships to resupply it, it's going to start a war. So he doesn't resupply it, but he's getting close to doing that. But before that happens, the rebel forces, which had laid siege to the fort, they had surrounded it and everything, they begin to shell the fort with artillery. Nobody dies. I think a horse gets killed, but the fort surrenders to the South. Lincoln, of course, he can't have this. He has to move. He will interestingly not ask Congress to declare war. Why? He says, you are not a country. He does not recognize the Confederate States of America. You are not a country. You are rebels. At best, you are sort of a prodigal son, right? This, again, biblical. He talks about how, you should come back and all will be forgiven kind of stuff. He says, this is not a conflict among equals. It's not a war. It's a rebellion. Therefore, I am not going to call on Congress to declare war, because only Congress can declare war. But he still acts as commander-in-chief to go to war. Quotation marks around war, right? Because we know what war looks like. Officially speaking, this is not a war from the Union perspective. This is simply a move by the Union, by the United States, to squash a rebellion within it. So as commander-in-chief, he issues a war proclamation. Commander-in-chief, he's in charge of the military. He says, we need to engage our military to keep the Union together. And he calls on patriots to run to the Union cause. He calls on states to send men, and he calls on men to sign up. After this, more states begin to secede. There are 11 now. The war has begun. You have, of course, in blue, the Union, in red, the Confederacy, and notice there are 4 states there. These are going to be important. Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Maryland. These are states which are slaveholding states, but which remain in the Union. They're going to be called the border states, but they are within the Union. This is going to make it difficult for Abraham Lincoln with regard to the issue of slavery. These are slaveholding states. They're within the Union. They've decided to stay, but they may not stay forever. Because if Lincoln moves too fast in the minds of these people in the states, if Lincoln moves too fast, he might lose them. This is the state of things. War pretty much has begun. The war proclamation is there. Both sides are confident that they will win a short war. They both think it's going to be short. The North, the North has major, well, let me back up a little bit. The North is much more confident that they're going to win. Both are confident about a short war, largely because the North has major advantages. The North has more states. You don't have to count them, but they do. You can count them if you want. It has a much greater population. A lot more people living in the North. The North has some 23 million people at this time. The South, some 9 million. 4 million of those people are slaves. So they're greatly outnumbered in the South by the North. There are more states, right? They have a much greater manufacturing base, which means they can build transportation. They can build ships. They can build railroads. They can build weapons. The South is going to have to pay for this stuff from other countries. It has some manufacturing, but it's really very little compared to the northern, what the North has. Even Southerners are not so sure that they have a great chance because of the major advantages that the North has. Now, the first major battle shakes all of this loose. The Union loses badly. It's the Battle of Bull Run, right? Bull Run. This is the first major battle of the Civil War. The Union loses badly, and it shows that the South is tough to beat. This is going to be a long war. The South has a couple of advantages. One, it's fighting a defensive war. The war will be fought in the South. And so, because it's a defensive war, well, you'd rather fight in your own backyard than you would in an unknown terrain, I suppose, right? Home field advantage and all that, to use a sports metaphor. So there's that. It is fought in their backyards. They know the ins and outs of the territory, the Southerners do. But the other thing is that they're able, Southern leaders, Confederate leaders, are able to rally the troops because they tell the troops the North is invading your home. You need to defend it. They're coming down here to end slavery. So they say this to ordinary white men who don't necessarily have a financial interest in slavery, but who do have an interest in keeping their status in their society. Confederate leaders will tell these young men, and everybody really, hey, the North is coming down here to free the slaves. Not only are they going to free them, they're going to make them equal. And they're going to be sleeping with your sister before you know it. This is the kind of stuff that they tell them. And so the Northern invasion of the South becomes a rallying cry for Southerners. And in fact, this is part of, the whole mythology or phenomenon of a rebel yell. The rebel yell, the rebel soldiers would go into battle, fighting, ululating, right? I'm not going to try to even do it. I'm not even sure anybody's ever recorded the rebel yell. I think they have, but it is It is basically a yell that they yell as they go into battle. And for them, it is a rallying cry. They're defending their home. They're defending the honor of the South. They are defending their way of life. That's huge. Now, the South also has more experienced military men. The military academies of the Union Army, almost all of them are in the South. And a lot of these people that are in these academies are going to side with the South. Not all of them, but there's going to be some notable ones like Robert E. Lee. So the war is going on. The war has started, right? And they're going to realize very quickly that it's not going to be a short war. From the very beginning, Lincoln is beset by problems. Right away, he's hit from all sides. There are Democrats who, of course, a lot of the remaining Democrats in the party, even in the North, support the South. They sympathize with the Confederacy. They want Abraham Lincoln to tread softly when it comes to this war. And they work against him in many ways. They sympathize with the Confederacy. So he's got it from that side, from the Democrats. But he even gets hit within his own party. Within his own party, there are radical Republicans. These are the radical Republicans. These people are calling for an end to slavery altogether. And they want Lincoln to push with all he's got, to push that military into the South and just destroy the South and confiscate all their property. People, of course, then you free them, but of course, also the plantations. And so Democrats are hitting them, radical Republicans are hitting them. Democrats want a conciliatory approach, a soft approach, and the radical Republicans want a very hard approach. At the same time, he has to recognize, that these states here, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Kentucky, Maryland, right? And Virginia, excuse me, I have to pause. Sorry about that. So Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. These are the slave states. West Virginia, I think I misspoke. West Virginia is not part of them. West Virginia actually breaks off from the state of Virginia and joins the Union. So here, there are several states. This is what you need to know from this. There are several border states, 4 of them, right, that are teetering on the fence, so to speak. They are still within the Union, but they are slave-holding states, and they're not about to let their slaves go. They are in the Union because they believe in Union. They don't want the country to break apart. So Democrats are hitting him. He's got people hitting him within his own party, and he's got this situation on the border, so to speak. Meanwhile, Black Northerners are also pushing. They're volunteering to fight. They believe that the war is about freedom. The war, they say, is a war to end slavery. So they're trying to make this about something that Lincoln says it's not. Lincoln is going to carve his own path. To the Northern Democrats, the Democrats in the North, he says, be careful of treason. He warns them of treason. He'll lock them up. In fact, he suspends habeas corpus. What is habeas corpus? That's a fancy Latin term. It kind of means surrender the body. It is a legal term today in the sense that, well, here's the thing. We all have a right to habeas corpus. It's in the Constitution. If you get thrown in jail for anything, then they cannot just leave you there. You have to have your body surrendered by the jailer, whoever locked you up, have your body surrendered by the jailer to a magistrate, to a judge, where that judge will tell you why you're being held and ask you how you plead and what you have to say for yourself, perhaps. Well, this is in the Constitution, but he suspends it. And when he does, he's called a traitor, and Southerners want him, quote unquote, for treason. This is one of the reasons that a lot of Southerners today will say he's a tyrant, just like they did back then. Lincoln was a tyrant. I've heard people say it. Lincoln was a tyrant, right? He went against the Constitution. And in fact, during the war, he has some 14,000 people arrested and kept in jail during the war without a trial. The irony, of course, is that he will say, look, and this is tough because we have to be careful, right? On the one hand, we don't want emergencies to invalidate the Constitution or to make it easy for us to ignore important pieces of the Constitution. On the other hand, this is an emergency beyond all emergencies. Now, he says that if I allow this, the Union will break up. And if the Union can be broken up, then it never really existed in the first place. It was never a Union. And he can't accept that. And he goes on to say, okay, more rogues than honest men hide behind the law. And what does he mean by that? That more bad guys than good guys hide behind laws. So he says, I'm going to do this. And it's ironic because here we have a war to save the Union that involves suspension of freedoms. Now, technically speaking, this may have been unconstitutional. Why? Because habeas corpus cannot be suspended by the presidency, by the president. Habeas corpus can be suspended, but it would take Congress. It's in Article 1 of the Constitution, by the way. It takes a congressional act. But Congress does, in fact, okay this after he does it. It takes a little time, but they do. They okay this and say fine. So he warns them, and he basically says, we are not going to have traitors in our midst. The Union is much too important. I am not going to sacrifice the Union by adhering too closely to the Constitution. Now, we may agree with this, we may not. The point is that when presidents take this tact, right, when they take this tactic, it can create a bad precedent, meaning a bad example, right, for later presidents who are not good guys necessarily. So he says to Northern Democrats, be careful, you're going to be treasonous, or I can lock you up for treason. To the radicals within his own party, and to the border states, and to free black people who think the war is about something more, all these people who are concerned over the slavery issue, he says, no, the war is one to save the Union. This is not about slavery. Now, black people will continue to believe otherwise. The black community is going to rally in support of this war. Black churches hold meetings. They talk about the meaning of war. For them, they see a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. They see that the war can bring them something more, that it is a continuation of sorts of the American Revolution. Frederick Douglass, for his part, says this war is intimately tied with freedom. The war is about slavery. He says this. And he believes that white folk just haven't recognized it yet, or a lot of them haven't. So a lot of black churches hold meetings on what the war means and how they can help. We have women sewing uniforms and volunteering to be nurses, and even talking about willing to fight, being willing to fight. Black men, of course, declared their will to fight. In fact, some black men, after the war jumps off and before they're even going to be fighting, they begin to mobilize and organize themselves. I think this was the wrong picture. What happened to those pictures? Could be wrong. Sorry about that. Let me see. So black men, they're going to come together. I'll give you an example. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, black men come together and they begin to train, and they call themselves the Hannibal Guards. Now, if you know anything about world history, Hannibal was a famous general, right? And Hannibal he was from Northern Africa, right? I think in the country, right around what is Tunisia. Of course, he led the country Carthage at the time. Anyway, he's from Africa, so he was an African. So he's claimed as a black man, right, by these Hannibal Guards. Hannibal was a brilliant leader who led elephants over, through the Straits of Gibraltar, through Spain, through what is today France, and down over the Alps into Italy to attack Rome. This surprise attack with elephants, no less. Anyway, they call themselves the Hannibal Guards. It's an ode. It is an homage, right? It is in respect to Hannibal. So they're making connections as a black community with roots around the world, interestingly enough. But of course, we also have the Attucks Guards. Attucks, as in Crispus Attucks. You may remember this guy was the first casualty of the American Revolution. Killed in what becomes known as the Boston Massacre. So they're making also a connection with him and with blackness in a sense, and with this idea of African Americanness or black or American blackness, however you want to put it. Now, these black men are rebuffed. They're not wanted by the military at first. A lot of people fear black men with guns. A lot of people fear black men fighting for freedom. If black men are fighting for freedom, it distorts notions of what equality and freedom are in the minds of a lot of people, even in the North. In fact, a lot of these men who sign up or who offer their services, who come together, they organize themselves to fight, they are going to be rebuffed, and often they're going to be cursed at and told, this war has nothing to do with you. They're told, quote, it's a white man's war. But these people, parts of the Hannibal Guards and Attucks Guards and others like them, aren't going to believe that. In the South, slaves immediately begin to run away in large numbers, particularly when they know that the Union Army is nearby. There's so many of them that end up running away that generals aren't going to know what to do with them at first. So here we have in the North, free people offering their service. In the South, slaves are going to start leaving the plantations in large numbers, trying to go to the Union side. Because of this, slaves will become both pawns and players in this war. They will be pawns in the sense that they will be used, but they will be players in the sense that they are going to be part of the victory for the Union. Agents of their own future. By July of 1861, hundreds of slaves have run away to join the Union camps. These too can be called revolutionary slaves, I suppose. They too are seeking to turn the wheel, in a sense, toward freedom, to revolve that wheel, to go back to natural rights. A lot of these people are going to be motivated by the actions of a guy named Benjamin Butler, General Benjamin Butler. General Butler issues an order that says that any slave that runs to the Union Army will not be returned. He calls them contraband. Contraband is stuff that you have that you're not supposed to have. And in war, contraband is property that is taken from you in times of war. If you're fighting each other, typically you try to take the other person's property. He says, well, the South has always said they were property, so I'm going to treat them as property when they come to me. Under the laws of war, I can do that. I don't have to return them. This maneuver by Butler is going to change the nature of the war. It's going to change it because they're going to be, in a sense, pawns in the war, but agents of their own future. As pawns, they're going to, in fact, this maneuver of calling them contraband is going to drain the South of a major labor, of its labor source. By saying, I'm keeping these people, which you call property, I'm going to encourage them to run off to me. It's going to, of course, create problems for you. Much like during the American Revolution, when Lord Dunmore issues this proclamation, right? And the Clinton proclamation, we are keeping these people. And of course, not only is this going to drain the South of a much needed labor source in the South, but it's going to upset white fears about runaways. And so a lot of men may be dissuaded, discouraged from going off to war because there may be slave runaways on your farm, your plantation, whatever. So they're going to be used as pawns, but they're also going to be players, agents of their own future. They're going to strike out for themselves. They're going to be inspired by ideas of freedom. You're going to see men and women, slaves, who rush off to the Union Army, and they're going to end up actually working for wages. They're going to be paid. And unlike during the American Revolution when they ran off to the British, right? They're going to be paid. They're going to be growing their own crops. They're going to be doing things like cooking, grave digging, carpentry work, porters, carrying stuff, seamstresses, but they're also going to act as spies. Slaves are going to act as spies. Notably, there's a woman named Harriet Tubman, right? Who, already having escaped and done all these things, she is going to act as a spy for the Union Army. Mary Elizabeth Bowser, she actually is going to be a spy. She, in fact, so she's working for the Union, but pretending to work for the Confederacy. At one point, Mary Elizabeth Bowser actually tries to burn down the Confederacy's White House. she doesn't make it. She doesn't get it done, I mean. So the point is, they are striking out on their own. Yeah, they're being used by the North, but they're going to strike out on their own. They're going to get wages. They're going to have their own crops to sell because they're growing their own crops. At the same time, they're going to be helped by missionaries. They're going to be helped by other abolitionists, black and white. They're going to be taught, to read, and they're going to be taught practices and ideas of moral uplift, right? Lift up the population. Other generals will also claim runaways as contraband of war. And thousands of slaves will seek freedom in the Union camps. Interestingly enough, Congress will take notice. 1861, Congress passes the Confiscation Act. And this act authorizes what is already happening. It authorizes the taking of Confederate slaves. So this is an official act by Congress saying, yes, it's official. If they come over to you, keep them. Later on, there's other confiscation acts, but later on, they will pass another confiscation act that will prohibit their return. Not only will a general or can a general accept these people and hold on to them, a general cannot return them. These confiscation acts, I'm not going to ask you to break them down. Confiscation Act of 1861 and the second confiscation, all that. We'll just talk about confiscation acts. The first one, as I said, basically makes it official. You don't have to give them back. Later confiscation acts will add to that. They'll say not only do you not have to give them back, you can't give them back. And later ones will also say freedom for any slaves who are there and any new refugees fleeing the Confederacy. So these confiscation acts are military maneuvers. They are meant to drain the South of its workforce and to destabilize the South, to strike fear in the South by the prospect of runaway slaves. But writ large, in the long run, it's going to have an effect that is going to, and it's going to turn, it has a part in changing people's minds about what the war is about. So not only do you keep them, but you can't, these people will be freed, these refugees. Now, we have to be careful. Congress is not going to go too far. Remember, slavery is still protected in certain ways. This is a military maneuver, the Confiscation Act. Slavery is protected in certain ways. Remember those 4 border states? Slavery is fine there. And if any refugee comes to a Union camp, but he's a slave of a faithful Union, of a member of the Union, then they're going to be returned. So if you happen to be a slave who is owned by a Union patriot, so to speak, you will be returned. This is not about ending slavery. This is about destabilizing the South. In fact, Congress and the president agree that, in fact, these confiscation acts also make it possible, give authority to the president to take all these refugees and colonize them somewhere else. Lincoln is a fan of colonization still. He doesn't really believe that black people and white people can live together, that there's always going to be racial strife. So in fact, freeing these slaves isn't necessarily about freeing them and leaving them in their midst. It's about freeing them and sending them out. So Congress and the president, they're not going too fast, too far, or too far, too fast. But we don't even know. There are unknown numbers of slaves that strike out on their own and decide, I'm not going to the North. I'm not going to anything. They actually just decide they're going to do their own thing. They're not going to go to the Union Army, I should say. They're not going to go to the Union Army. They will keep going, maybe go to the North on their own and just live, or organize maroon settlements, which they do. They leave in large numbers because they say, I'm not going to take my chances with the South. I'm not going to take my chances with the Union. I'm not going to go north. I'm going to go west. And a lot of them do. Because of all of this, and as the war goes on, a lot of white people are beginning to fear more and more so that what the war might mean. In the South, they're more convinced that the war is one to end slavery because they see the confiscation acts and all these people running away. Northerners are also wondering, how far are we going to go here? I don't think we started this to end slavery. Why do we seem to be going in that direction? How far will we go? Are we going to end slavery in the South altogether? Not everybody likes that. Now, Lincoln, by 1862, is still publicly stating that his primary goal in fighting the war is to save the Union. He famously says in 1862, if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. Now, this is very tricky because remember, he's saying this publicly. He has political issues to deal with. He's hit on all these different sides. We're going to talk more about this in a moment. But privately, he's being appealed to already by Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is saying, put black men on the field to fight. You should announce that this war is a war to end slavery. And privately, he's listening, and that is Lincoln is listening, and he's also fearing that maybe the North by 1862 is losing its spirit to fight. By 1862, the war is going rather poorly for the North. And he believes that he needs to inject a new spirit, a new vitality, a new reason, a new purpose for the war. And he's wondering whether or not slavery and making the war about slavery would get him that. So already by 1862, he's changing. Publicly, he has to say something. Privately, he's having all these other conversations with others and himself. But he knows he can't move too fast. Most people in the North are hostile to equality, which is the next step after slavery. He also might lose those who have a positive or, no opinion on slavery. And of course, he's especially concerned about the border states. He's especially concerned also about his military commanders who did not sign up to end slavery, who had signed up for the Union cause of maintaining the Union. But he also knows that it's possible that he can actually join his two goals. One of these goals is winning the war. You win the war, you maintain the Union. But his other goal is ending slavery. And he starts to wonder, how can I do this? Well, continue confiscation, right? And maybe in the future announce the end of slavery as the goal, as the future of the nation. Maybe not so much the goal of this war, but announce the end of slavery as the future of the nation. But first, we must win this war and reconstitute ourselves as a union and reconsider the slavery question. He has all these concerns on his mind with regard to slavery. He also realizes that England and France are on the sidelines right now. England in particular is being sought by the South. The South wants England to recognize the Confederate States of America, at least recognize it. More so, wants it to join on their side. The French as well are out there. So Lincoln needs to keep England and France from joining the war. And he believes that maybe he can do this, by joining the war on the southern side. And he believes that maybe he can do this by announcing that the war will end slavery. Now, England and France, they need southern cotton. They buy a lot of it. But they have also outlawed slavery. And they would also prefer to work with a free country rather than a slaveholding country. Lincoln knows this. So with all of these things in mind, that people are hostile to the end of slavery, even in the North, but maybe he needs to inject a new vitality in the will to fight, that he can join his goals. He can also keep England and France out by announcing that the war is won to end slavery. And so he begins looking, in a sense, for a major victory to declare his new goals. He needs a major victory, because if he does this now, when things aren't going all that great for the North, then it might look desperate, like he's grasping for things to make the war about, to just sort of pander to people. So he waits for a major Union victory, and he gets it. And it's the Battle of Antietam. Now, don't worry about whatever. The Battle of Antietam is actually in your one of those videos, so make sure you look at that. So I should rephrase. Do worry about that. Watch the video. The Battle of Antietam is the bloodiest battle in U.S. history, and it is a major victory for the North. It is after this that he announces the new goal, not just winning the war and preserving the Union, but ending slavery. He issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, he officially signs it January 1st, 1863, but we should also recognize that this is a military maneuver and a political maneuver. This guy was bright in many ways. Here's what this does. This Emancipation Proclamation declares that all slaves living in territories still in rebellion, are forever free. What does this mean? All slaves in territories still in rebellion are forever free. It means that slaves living within the Union control are not free. This really just sort of suggests, not suggests, but what it declares is that slaves living in territory that is not controlled by the United States are free. So how many slaves does this actually free? Not one. Not one. Because if you are fighting me and you own slaves and I tell you your slaves are free, you're going to be like, yeah, man, whatever. So it doesn't free a single slave. But it's brilliant because he announces this as a goal, ending slavery, but at the same time, it's soft enough to satisfy a lot of people. If he went outright abolition, slavery and he wouldn't even have said he had the right to do this, in fact, because he's using his powers as commander-in-chief as a war measure, right? The proclamation is a war measure. He can do this as commander-in-chief, but it's not clear that he can end slavery throughout the Union. So he would have told you that. But he's also very, very concerned because if he even declared such a thing, border states, those 4 border states, may jump the fence to the south. And Union commanders may just drop their weapons and go home, or maybe go to the other side. And he's still telling people that colonization is the answer. So this Emancipation Proclamation has at its heart a wonderful principle. And on the one hand, you can say that Lincoln was hypocritical. I don't see him that way. I see him as being brilliant in the sense that he publicly declares his desire to end slavery, but at the same time, he's keeping slavery, or at least recognizing that slavery is legitimate in lots of areas of the country. He's going to still be praised by a lot of people. Frederick Douglass praises him. Frederick Douglass had been calling on him for him to do that. Remember, these guys were friends. Of course, Frederick Douglass, famously, when he goes to the White House, he's told to use the back entrance because he's black. He's not really wanted, or at least when he tries to go in, he's stopped by guards, by officials who tell him, what are you doing here, kind of thing. And of course, it takes Lincoln to intervene and say, hey, this guy's with me. Anyway, Frederick Douglass has been asking Lincoln to do this for a long time. And so when he does it, Frederick Douglass loves him for it, in a sense, right? And abolitionists, both white and black, they dance in the streets when they hear the Emancipation Proclamation. They know what it means, but they see it as another step forward. They read the proclamation to large groups. They read it to each other. They know what it means. They get together and they sing, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty." Meanwhile, slaves are running away in even greater numbers to the north, to the Union camps because they believe in this thing called freedom. A lot of Northern black men praise the proclamation because this proclamation also authorizes the Union Army to accept and train black men for battle. The Union needs men. Just give me one moment, please. Okay, I'm starting another section right now. I'm kind of gonna just sort of tie all these videos together. It's gonna be one long video, but I'm doing it in sections, and so I'm starting another section right now. I guess I could make it seamless, but anyway. Okay, so the last thing we were talking about, we talked about how the proclamation authorized the Union Army to accept and to train black men for battle. Because at this time, things aren't looking all that good for the North. They might lose. Excuse me. And he issues this proclamation, right? And he injects, that is Lincoln, and he injects a whole new vigor into the bloodstream, so to speak. And as I said, the proclamation does several things. It's a political move. It's a military move. It doesn't end up actually freeing a single slave, but it does have an effect on how people view the war. It keeps England out, and it emboldens a lot of black people. I mean, black men had already volunteered. They had been rebuffed, but they have volunteered by now. And in fact, even before the Emancipation Proclamation, Union commanders had already begun to recruit and to organize black men in anticipation of the move. And so they were kind of going, as they were under their military authority, engaging in the organization and recruitment of black men. An example of this is the first South Carolina Volunteers. These were black men who were not fielded; they were not put into the army, but they had been trained, right, or at least they had been organized, and so they will eventually be on the field. So you have a picture of that, or at least a drawing commemorating that. Another one would be the Louisiana Native Guard. This is an actual picture, and these are men who are coming together for the muster, right? Meaning coming together and prepare to fight. So these things had already been happening even before the proclamation. And again, it's because the Union needs men that the proclamation includes this provision, right? Authorizing the Union Army to accept and train black men for battle. By now, it's clear that the Union needs them. For white people in the North, their fervor for war had largely cooled. They by this time are chafing at the Enrollment Act, which is basically a draft, right? So they didn't like the fact that they had to actually enroll into the Civil War as fighting men. They were drafting adult males, the Union. They were drafting lots of immigrants. And a lot of the immigrants actually answer the call. A lot of immigrants especially the Irish. They are coming here in large numbers, and a lot of these men, they feel a genuine loyalty to their new country. A lot of them, perhaps the same men, but a lot of them actually want to prove that they belong. So what better way to do this than to hit the ground running, so to speak? You come here and there's a war going on, and before you know it, you're wearing a Union uniform, and you're calling yourself American, so to speak, and you're fighting for the Union. And think about what this means also for the term, American. What does it mean to be a quote unquote American? These men, these immigrants, and these Irish were, yeah, the Irish are discriminated against for sure, but they're going to be accepted into the Union Army pretty much fresh off the boat. Some 150,000 Irishmen actually end up serving in the Union Army. Now, a lot of men, though, refuse to be drafted. They don't like the fact that the draft seems to target poor and ordinary folk, men, who cannot afford $300. Because one of the things that the Enrollment Act does is it says if you can pay $300, then you don't have to serve. We'll just take your money. Now, there is evidence to show that the money probably would have been just as or more so important than service, because the Union also needs money. But from the point of view of ordinary men, poor white men who cannot afford $300, $300 was a lot of money back then. I don't know how much. I didn't do the calculation or look it up on Google, right? I'm sure you can do that if you're curious. But $300 is a lot of money. To just give you an understanding, in 1900, some 40 years later, the average salary was about $1 a day, right? So this was, not quite a year's salary for a lot of people. It was a lot of money. And so anyone who could afford to pay $300 to avoid the draft, this enrollment, they were called $300 men, a $300 man. And so, sometimes, not only were they disliked, sometimes they would be attacked. So a lot of poor white men in the North feel that the draft targets them unfairly. They can't get out of it because they don't have the money. But they also don't like the fact that they see the war turning into a war to end slavery. Example of this hostility toward the draft and toward the war happens in the summer of 1863 in New York City, with the New York City draft riots, where lower class whites and Irish immigrants, they just stampede, they rampage New York City, especially the black neighborhoods. They target black folk. They burn black homes. They lynch dozens of random black people. They attack children. They actually burn the colored orphan asylum. I think it was in Harlem, but New York City. They burn this thing to the ground, and some 100 or so children they have to flee. Some white folks risk their own lives to save these kids from the brutal mob. They take them into their homes, and so this is a mess. And these riots spread through the North to other northern cities. And meanwhile, the Democratic media, remember the Democrats are the party of slavery, they fan the flames. They say the Emancipation Proclamation is unconstitutional. The president doesn't have the power to do what he presumes to be doing here. And then they go on to say the freeing of 4 million slaves will bring nothing but horror. Black men living next door to you, or maybe raping your wives or having sex with your wives and sisters, and maybe they like it. So that is inflaming a lot of anti-war sentiment in the North amongst this population of people. It's clear by now that even if slavery ends, the hatred won't. Black people, even in the North, as the war seems to be turning against slavery, or as a war to end slavery, Black people are still not going to be seen as Americans. And think about the lynching of dozens of random black people in New York City in 1863. At this point, even in the North, do Black lives matter? Look at what happens to these children. So the Union needs men because they know that there's a lot of resistance amongst the white Northerners. Not all, I mean, but there is a stream, and so that is the Union Army recruits black men, and these men fight heroically for the Union when they're finally called upon to do so. An example of this is the African Brigade. The African Brigade it's going to be renamed the First Louisiana, right? First Louisiana. This is the first group of black men to actually fight. Most of these men were former slaves, and they fight bravely in the heart of the South, in Louisiana. So much, and they fight so bravely that it prompts the secretary or the assistant secretary of war. Today it's called the Defense Department. Back in the day, it was called the War Department. The U.S. Assistant Secretary of War, he says, look, their bravery, the bravery of the African Brigade has changed many minds. Not only are they dying, but these men are fighting bravely. And, you know, and the thing about it is some of these guys, when they're captured by the South, they're enslaved or killed on the spot, because the Confederacy cannot fathom the fact that they have to fight against armed black men. The point being that they fight bravely, and in so doing, they change the minds of a lot of people who thought, no, these guys aren't going to be any good at this. You can't trust a black man or a bunch of black men with guns. They're going to just turn them on you, so to speak, right? But again, the exploits of the African Brigade changes a lot of minds. Now, you may be more familiar with these guys, the Massachusetts 54th, and you'll be familiar with them more so if you've ever seen the movie Glory, which came out like right, I don't know, 1990, 91. Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, that one guy from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, I can't remember his name, Matthew something. Matthew Broderick, right? Anyway, there's a movie about this, and I really quite like it. The Massachusetts 54th will become the most famous group of men. These are men who mostly had never been enslaved, although the movie kind of plays with that a little bit. But these were men who were almost all to a man, never having been enslaved. In fact, two of Frederick Douglass's own sons served in the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. Now, they get put together, but they're not allowed to fight at first. This is going to be the first regiment, by the way, and that means it's a bigger sort of group, not just like the African Brigade. Now, they're not allowed to fight at first, and it's because of deep prejudice and fear, right? The idea of black men with guns, the idea that they could actually be good fighters. People don't want to have to deal with those thoughts. So the military has them digging ditches. They have them doing drills like marching and practicing shooting. They have them building fortifications, porting supplies, the usual thing. But these men are eager to fight. And they're going to get their chance. But they're most famous for their assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. Fort Wagner was a fort on the beach, and the Southerners, the rebels, are deeply entrenched behind the battlements of Fort Wagner. And the Union needs someone to try to dislodge these rebel forces. This fort is an important logistical piece in the war. I'm not a military historian. I can't tell you exactly why and all that. The important thing for me here is that this was basically a suicide mission. And they volunteer. They storm under Colonel Shaw. Colonel Shaw, by the way, was a white man who really was exceptional in the sense that he really wanted his men, the black men under him, the 54th, to actually fight. That he really thought of them as fighting men, unlike a lot of other military leaders. He leads this charge of Fort Wagner on the beach, and as I said, it's a suicide mission. They attack the battlements. They incur heavy losses, including their commander, Colonel Shaw. But when news of this battle gets out, and you should watch the movie, when news of this battle gets out, it electrifies the nation, especially not just white people generally, but especially white soldiers whose minds are being changed because they didn't trust what black men could do. They didn't trust black men with guns. But white people are changing, are having their minds changed. Black people across the nation are electrified. At the end of the day, some 200,000 black men will serve in the Union Army and Navy together. But of course, these men are going to experience lots of prejudice in the Union. They're almost never going to be officers. They're certainly not allowed to lead white men. You just can't have that here. Now, a very, very select few become officers. Most of them are what are called non-coms, non-commissioned officers. You may know more about the military than I do. I don't know a whole lot. There are non-commissioned officers who are not management. They're basically in charge of specific tasks, maybe, training or in shooting, training in marksmanship, training in a strategy or something. But they're not really leading men into battle. They're not management, so to speak. So black men are almost never officers. A few of them do become officers, actual officers, but most are non-coms, non-commissioned. Black men who go into battle, they're led by white officers. And many of these guys are not good officers. They see the assignment as, I'll be honest with you, kind of like crap duty. It's just like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to lead black men. And so a lot of the men who lead regiments, like the 54th, unlike Shaw, a lot of these men, they're not committed to this. They're not committed to the idea that black men belong in the United States military. They're not committed to the idea, or they don't even accept the idea that black men will make good soldiers. And so they don't really, the least you expect out of someone, the less they're going to give you, right? Colonel Shaw was a rare exception. He was eager for his men to train and fight, and this guy's eventually killed alongside them at Fort Wagner. So point is, there's this difference between the fighting men and, of course, their officers, and they're also going to be paid less. Black men are going to be paid less. They're going to be paid $10 versus $13. Not only are they paid $3 less, but they have to pay for their own food, their own clothing, while whites do not. So not only are you getting paid less as a black man, $10, but you have to pay for your own food and clothing, while the other guy is getting paid $13 and doesn't have to come out of pocket for these things. In fact, the reality that they are paid less sparks resistance. In one instance, you see a mutiny among blacks. So there's a South Carolina regiment. I can't remember what it's called. It's a black regiment that mutinies. They actually try to overtake their officers, their white officers, because of the difference in pay. They're not having this. Well, one black man is actually executed for this because you cannot mutiny, right? The Massachusetts, and this is a scene actually in Glory, so you can see that if you like. Massachusetts 54th, they decide they're not going to accept any pay at all until they get equal pay. And in fact, Congress finally does this. It equalizes equal pay in like 1864. And once they equalize pay, they actually see a huge enrollment in black recruits, a huge increase in black recruits. And this is something, right? And it's not necessarily the money. I'm sure that's part of it, but it's this idea that you're starting to see me as an equal, at least for this, right? So I enroll. And as a black man going into the army in the Civil War, you're going to face greater danger. You're going to be enslaved. Even if you were a free black man in the North, you will be enslaved or executed on the spot. This was sort of unofficial Confederate practice. And you're not supposed to do that in war. Now, black people in the South, they endure the war in their own way. We know that they're a major, major labor source for the South. Both enslaved and free black men and women, they work for the South. They grow food, cotton for, they grow the cotton for sale. They're building roads and fortifications. They are engaging in personal services like laundering and cooking and so forth like that, right? But what's interesting is that they live in a sort of duality. They are, because of the war and because of the fears of slave uprisings, because of the fears really more so of slaves running away, they're going to be further restricted. Slave patrols in the South are beefed up. They're going to have less freedom to move. But ironically, perhaps, they're going to see opportunities for some greater freedom. Remember, there are thousands of slaves that are running off. They are draining the South of manpower, helping the North. So those who don't run away, those who stay behind, are going to be highly prized. Because the thinking is, if I own slaves, I don't want them running off, so I might just treat them a little bit better. You can't move, the slave patrols are beefed up, but within the plantation, I might just treat you a little bit better, because if I push you too hard, you might just bolt on me. And so slaves in the South are able, because of the circumstances, to actually carve out a little something for themselves, some benefits. They are able to farm their own plots of land, where the slave owner says, okay, that's your land right there. You can go ahead and farm that now. And you can sell your own produce. It's not necessarily theirs to own, the land, I mean, but it is theirs to use and to farm. They have possession of it, and they can sell their own produce. Some of these slaves actually move into better housing that they rent for themselves. Some of them are even paid for their work. Now, let's not take this too far. This is not happening everywhere and as a matter of policy, but in certain instances in which a plantation owner believes it is in his best interests to do this, you see this happening. So black people in the South they're living this sort of interesting duality. Black men in the South are also, just like in the North, going to be considered for soldier duty. But there's a debate, right? Because on the one hand, people say, look, we need men. We need men. We are outnumbered by the North by far. But there's a lot of people who push against that. They say, what are you talking about? Why would you arm these slaves? Black men generally, slaves in particular. If you actually put slaves in the field, you're never going to see them again, because in the fog of war, so to speak, bullets start flying, people start running. You're not going to, they're just going to run off. Didn't we leave the Union to protect our property? Why would we put our property on the battlefield just to see them run away? And others all add to that, and they say, yeah. And if black men, if you want them to be soldiers, you want them to be good soldiers. And if they actually make good soldiers, then the whole basis of our society is wrong. They say this, right? They admit, they recognize that the basis of their society is basically what Alexander Stephens said it is. And that is that it is the idea that black men are inferior to white men. So they say, if black men actually make good soldiers, then we were wrong about this whole thing, and they can't fathom that. Meanwhile, black Union troops are proving that they were wrong about that. their exploits on the battlefield, such as what happens at Fort Wagner. Now, there's so much to do with the Civil War that, you can take a whole class on the Civil War, right? I'm not going to go into battles and so forth. I'm going to talk now about winding things down, ending the war. By 1863, the tide of war is turning in favor of the North. The Black troops have come in at just the right time. One of these, I don't remember if it was a colonel, a general, is a high-ranking military officer who actually says, look, the use of black men in battle was, quote, the heaviest blow yet dealt to the rebels. The heaviest blow yet dealt to the rebels. For a couple of reasons, I imagine, and that is that these black troops come in at just the right time, right? Because the Union needs men, but also there's a psychological blow. And I think that's what he really means. That is that the fact that you are fielding black men against Southern rebels whose society is built on the idea of the inferiority of black men. And then as a white man, you're fighting them and losing to them. That's going to shake, in fact, something in your psyche. And so by 1863, the tide of war is turning. New notions of the war are taking shape, not just a war to save the Union. By 1863, countless white folk have come to accept what black people had said all along. The war is to end slavery. And by 1863, England has declined to recognize the Confederate States of America. They do not recognize them as a separate country. Lincoln, by this time, is looking for a chance to declare publicly and more forcefully a new vision for a war, for the war. He's going to get that with the Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg will be I'm sure you heard of it, right? A major, major battle. And it's a Union victory. A lot of people die, of course, but it's a turning point. This is a Union victory that will give him the political cover that he needs to finally, more forcefully, more clearly articulate his vision for the war, which was to save the Union, but now to free the slaves. After this battle, he visits Gettysburg, and by this time, it has been consecrated as a graveyard for the fallen at Gettysburg. And here, of course, is where he delivers his most famous speech in honor of those who were buried there, and in honor of those who are still fighting, and in honor of the new vision for the nation that he has. So you're all familiar. I mean, when I was a kid, I had to memorize at least the beginning of the Gettysburg Address, right? 407 years ago. And by the way, a score is 20. So he could have said 87 years ago, but Lincoln being Lincoln, he goes on. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. 407 years ago, he says, the people who brought, our fathers, our founding fathers, they brought together a new nation and they talked about liberty and equality. And by the way, 407 years before 1863, he's talking about the Declaration of Independence. He's not talking about the U.S. Constitution, because the U.S. Constitution stopped short of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence talks about liberty. It talks about equality. The Constitution does not. There's no mention of it at this point in 1863. So he says, look, this is what they did 407 years ago. But now we are engaged in the Great Civil War, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. What he's saying is, right now we are actually fighting over the very idea of such a nation. Can a nation who was built on the ideals of liberty and equality, can it survive? That's what he's saying. And he goes on, he says, it is for us the living to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. So it is up to us. The forefathers are gone. We have to take up the mantle, right? We have to fight this battle in order to come full circle, revolution, right? Come full circle to the founding principles. He said the task before us is, quote, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. He's saying these dead men died for a greater purpose. They died for the purpose of, in fact, fulfilling the principles embedded in the founding, in the Declaration of Independence. He said that we here must resolve that they did not die for nothing. We must resolve that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom. He talks about a new birth of freedom. Basically, what he's saying is the nation has to be reborn, in a sense, born again. To use a perhaps bad metaphor, the idea of being born again in Christianity, right, and the evangelical movement was the idea that to be born again, it is to give yourself up to God. You have a sort of cleansing, right, and an emotional conversion. Never mind all the bad things that you did in the past. You are born again, and that's kind of what's happening here. He's saying a new birth of freedom. We've done some things that we should we got away from who we are. And he says we have to resolve, right, that, and he goes back to the initial statement about whether or not such a nation can actually endure. He says we have to resolve that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish. It is up to us to ensure that the nation so conceived and so dedicated can endure. With fewer than 300 words, Lincoln revived the Declaration of Independence. It's like 272 words or something like that. It's a very short speech. So short that apparently there was one photographer who's trying to get a picture of him during the speech, and he couldn't get it because, back in the day, they had these, it's called a daguerreotype. You get the picture, right? Yeah, the big old accordion looking lenses, and they would have like a cloak or some sort of blanket that they would put over them to cover the light. He couldn't get it set up in time to take a picture of Lincoln while he was speaking, because this thing only lasted a couple minutes. But in his speech, he revives the Declaration of Independence, and he talks about the vision for the country that was lost, that in fact must be the vision for the future. He's talking about change. Does he sound like a liberal or a conservative? Now, I bring this up because my Republican friends like to claim Lincoln because Lincoln was a Republican, but they lose me when they start talking about him this way because Republicans today are conservative. Lincoln, for his time, was a liberal. It's interesting, at Tarrant County College here, we have student groups, right? Student organizations. You have the chess club, you have the math club, you have the history club, all these different groups. Of course, you also have the Republican Club and the Democratic Club. And these groups on a particular day every year or semester will set up their little tables and try to recruit people and so forth, right? I never see the Democrats and Republicans next to each other, at tables that are sort of adjoining, never close to each other. The point is, if you go by one, you will notice they're talking about Lincoln, Lincoln, Lincoln. And if you walk around the corner and you go to the other one, they're talking about, they both claim Lincoln. And it has to do a lot with the fact that Lincoln was, even though in name a Republican, in fact a liberal. You can tell me what you think about that in an email if you like. I'm always willing to listen to comments. Now, of course, he delivers this masterful stroke of a speech, but the war will last nearly 2 more years. Now, I should tell you that just interestingly enough, there's an irony here. Despite Lincoln's highfalutin, right, this highly vaunted language, Black troops are not going to be buried at this cemetery. They won't be allowed. The USCT, the United States Colored Troops, the USCT, they're not going to be buried at this cemetery. They're going to be buried just outside Gettysburg at a place called the Lincoln Cemetery. I think one Black man eventually gets buried there, but much, much later. Close to 1900, I think. So there's still an irony here, right? Despite Lincoln's language, look at what's happening here, right? Despite the fact that these men died in battle at Gettysburg, the fact that they did that, but still, as Black men are not buried there, what does that tell you about what it means, right, to be a Union soldier and a, quote, American? Anyway, the war will last nearly 2 more years. By the end of 1864, Union soldiers, because of the changes that we've seen, because of the new spirit that's been injected into this war with regard to the principles embodied in the Gettysburg Address, because of that, Union soldiers by 1864 are marching into battle singing about Jown Brown. There's a song called Jown Brown's Body. It celebrates Jown Brown as a hero of the Civil War, a hero of the American Revolution, really. This song is a song that is put to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which you may be familiar with. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's trampled all the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. Well, Jown Brown's body has different words. Notably, they talk about how, although his body is moldering in the grave, quote, his truth keeps marching on. So they're singing this as they're marching. By 1864, Union troops are celebrating a man who had died a traitor's death, because they have come to accept in large part that this war is about something else. It's about a new birth of freedom. And Jown Brown has given them this inspiration for the fight, a man who was called a traitor by Lincoln. All of this together has allowed, and other things, has allowed the Union to gain the advantage by the end of 1864. By then, the war has ravaged the South. The South is isolated. It's running out of money. It's not recognized by other countries, major countries like England. It has few men to fight. At this point, they consider putting Black men in the field, but not really. They don't really do this too much. well, they start to do it in 1865, but by the end of 1864, when it seems like they really would have needed them, they still hesitate. Meanwhile, this hesitation is going to cost them. Well, I shouldn't put it that way, because even if they fielded black men, they're not going to get very many. But here's the thing. By the end of 1864, we have a man named William Tecumseh Sherman. He's a general, of course, for the Union. He's going to drive through the South, burning major cities, including Atlanta. My wife lived in Atlanta for years. My son was born there. And there's this history in Atlanta about the Civil War that she was told, and she, to some degree, came to believe about how bad the North was and so forth. A lot of people in Atlanta, they can't stand Sherman because Sherman's march, he burns Atlanta to the ground. You may be familiar with the burning of Atlanta from the movie, or perhaps the book Gone with the Wind, which is a really distorted view of slavery. They burn Atlanta to the ground in that movie book. And today, a lot of people can't stand Sherman or the North in Atlanta. Sherman, as he drives through the South, burning cities like Atlanta, he destroys major infrastructure, bridges, roads, whatever factories they have. He destroys or takes natural resources. He really destroys the Southern morale to fight. By 1865, Southerners are starving. The South is in a shambles, and soldiers are hungry, they're sick, and news of Sherman's march has actually demoralized them. Here's where the CSA thinks, oh, maybe we should enlist black men. So they revisit this question, and they start to actually field black men, or at least enlist them. Now, a few thousand of them, black men, do end up wearing the gray, the uniform. And so the question is, why would they? Now, today, a lot of neo-Confederates, people who believe in the Southern cause and the states' rights mythology and so forth, they say that the fact that a few thousand men actually enlisted shows that the war was not about slavery. First of all, it's really difficult to know how many men enlisted, and it's really difficult to know whether they did so voluntarily, because these men were slaves. And so there may have been something in it for them, right? It's like, okay, you will get your freedom, your individual freedom. Now, you have to remember what slavery does to a person, right? Yes, there is camaraderie. Yes, there is a sense of community. But at the end of the day, if you can be free because someone puts a gun in your hand and they tell you to go fight for this cause, but you're also fighting for your own freedom, you might go. But they don't, only a few thousand, less than 1%, far less than 1% of the black men of fighting age in the South actually enlist. So, and again, a lot of this is, well, what's in it for him, right? But also coercion. Slave owners would tell him, you better go. And in fact, that's more likely the case because, in fact, there really isn't a whole lot of evidence to suggest that these men were going to be given their freedom. But we can imagine that might have been part of their thinking. What we do have a lot of evidence of is coercion. Go fight or else. And you have to think about it too. A lot of slaves are going to get 3 hots and a cot. Better, and they're going to, I mean, yeah, you have to go fight in war, but you're going to learn how to shoot. You're going to have to learn how to fight. You're not going to be working in the field. So, maybe avoid some hunger, maybe a little bit more room to move. There may be a bunch of reasons that they did. And again, a very, very small number of them actually did. But neo-Confederates today say the fact that some of these men enrolled shows that the war was not about slavery. Is that a good argument? I'll leave that for you to decide. Point is, it's too little, it's too late. Nothing. They're not really committed to this anyway. And by 1865, in the spring, it becomes clear the war is coming to an end. And General Robert E. Lee will surrender to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox. Once the surrender occurs, other Southern generals begin to stand down as well. It's very clear very soon that the CSA is dead. And by now, Congress has already moved to end slavery in the Union, in the nation. The 13th Amendment has been passed. It's awaiting ratification by the states, but it's pretty well a done deal. The point is, by the time the war ends, we already know what direction the country has chosen to go in, we think. And Union forces move through the South, delivering the news of the end of the war, delivering the news that slaves have been freed. And reportedly, it is the Texas slaves that are said to be the last of the freedmen to hear the news. Texas is kind of far away. They hear the news on June 19th, which is why, June 19th, 1865, right? Which is why there is a holiday that you may be familiar with called Juneteenth. It's celebrated every day in certain pockets and communities of the country. It is known sort of as Black Independence Day. And so you will see in cities across the country here and there, commemoration events, celebration events, like the one you see here. This one's in Texas, a place called DeSoto. June 19, 2021. So the war is over. There's a question that remains, of course. And I think it's a question that we're still trying to answer. And that is, what kind of country will we be? How far will we go in pursuing equality? We will talk about that next time when we talk about reconstructing the nation, not just literally, but figuratively, in the abstract. What kind of nation will we be after this cataclysm of war? Okay, people, I will leave it there. I appreciate your listening. I will sign off. Be well and be good. Take care.